Chapter 90. On the 21st of March, 1798, the rarest diamond ever discovered sold for the modest sum of £4 million in an undisclosed transaction at a secret location in Cape Town, South Africa. Jack had been surprised by how easy the process had been. He admitted the value was a little less than a quarter of what the diamond could have sold through legitimate portals. He decided it was very well, given that it wasn't, and it was still more gold than he could ever spend in his lifetime. He and Anna had spent more than a year in Cape Town by the time they had established the connections and means to return to London. It was longer than Anna had wanted, but he was adamant their time was better spent preparing the necessary arrangements so they could return without as much risk. They had already waited 11 years. What difference did another one make? In that time, they had discovered where Sir Robert Williams now resided. He had recently married a plain-looking heiress who was the daughter of the late Earl of Canterbury, and that he had 2 sons. With the exception of losing the world's most splendid diamond, he had generally been very lucky in life. Jack had soon discovered that by having an almost inexhaustible treasury, it meant everything was possible. He made arrangements for a London lawyer to purchase the Sinclair House, just 1 house down from Buckingham Palace and 4 houses up from Sir William's. The lawyer had been appalled that he had not wished to negotiate a price for the house, but instead insisted on paying exactly what was being asked. It was a decision which was both reckless and profligate, his lawyer, a Mr. Michael Fitzpatrick, advised him. He responded he was never the first, but almost entirely decided upon being the second in all circumstances. It was apparently a lavish house, with all luxuries imported by its previous owners, who, having made some poor speculations, found themselves in the disastrous position of bankruptcy. The sale was on behalf of the Bank of England. Arrangements had been made to improve the estate to their exact liking. Letters of introduction had been made with the Bank of London, and he had noted he would be staying in London shortly and would be making an extremely large deposit of gold. He had not ventured how he came by the money, but cared about his privacy and the security of his vast wealth. No news was found on the whereabouts of Anna's 2 sons, but Mr. Fitzpatrick knew of just the man who could discover their fate. Mr. Baker, it was said, was unscrupulous, vicious, and thought little of killing someone who got in his way, but would always be stringently loyal to whoever was willing to pay the highest price. So long as Jack was willing to be that person, he would forever have Mr. Baker's loyalty, and he was assured the truth about Anna's boys would come to surface as soon as possible. The trouble of transporting their gold seemed to present more of a problem than that of selling the diamond in the first place. There were laws designed to stop people transporting large amounts of money from one country to the other without the knowledge of customs. More important, though, was the risk of pirates. Gold was the most transferable of fortunes. It held very little to indicate where it had been sourced, and even in the form of ingots, could easily be melted down and sold at a similar price anywhere around the world. He had tried to entrust the gold to a bank, but had been advised such a vast sum could not be easily sourced overseas, and the risk of pirates currently made insurance unavailable. Jack knew very little about sailing, and very little about moving gold, and consequently he and Anna spoke at great lengths about the problem. It was the last obstacle in the way of their goal, and it appeared to be the most difficult. And then a clipper by the name of Serendipity sailed into port. She had come from the Californian gold fields. A new style of fast ship, the Clipper had a much narrower beam comparatively to her length, which made her very fast. She had 3 masts and a square rig. As they were so narrow, clippers could carry limited bulk freight. Their capacity was small by later 19th century standards, and they had a large total sail area. It was boasted to be the fastest ship in the seas currently. She will make the trip in good weather from Cape Town to Portsmouth in under 6 weeks. Her captain, John Jarrett, looked at his uncomprehending face. By comparison, it would take a British man-of-war somewhere in the realm of 18 weeks. I'm not interested in the speeds of a British man-of-war. They have no business with me. What about pirates? Surely their captains must sail fast ships if they are to capture any prizes. No pirate ship yet built could possibly pursue her. It was not a boast. Mr. Jarrett was simply stating a scientific certainty. What about in light winds? All ships are slower in light winds, but she can still do as much as 12 knots in small winds and up to 22 knots in moderate to large winds. In a lighter wind, we have more than double the canvas than conventional ships, which allows her to greatly increase her sail square footage. Jack was awed by her engineering, but fell in love with her beautiful, sleek lines. The Serendipity was exactly what he wanted. He needed to move his gold to England. He had considered buying a warship, but that would only tempt pirates, whereas he had been told a ship like the Serendipity could outsail any other ship on the ocean. He didn't need to consult Anna. She would agree. Very well, I'd like to own her. Aye, so would I, Mr. Jarrett laughed. A ship like this would fetch twice her value in breaking through one of the blockades, but I'm afraid she isn't for sale. All the same, I wish to purchase her. You said before, Mr. Layton, you need a fast ship to transport a valuable cargo from here to Portsmouth. Maybe we can arrange a trip for you on Consort. Out of the question. I need a fast ship and a crew that is entirely mine. I am richer than your current employer and will pay a much higher retainer. So, what do you say? The captain paused. I doubt very much you can buy my loyalty over the current owner. He has treated me very well over the years. I have done very well out of his trade. How much did you make last year? 27 pounds. It was a rude question, but like all sea captains, he was always looking for the next highest bidder. Well, let's say 40 pounds, and you will start as soon as I purchase her. What? 40 pounds a year? How many years? No. 40 pounds a trip, and a retainer of 50 pounds a year to ensure the crew and the vessel are always ready. Well, then I'd say you have just purchased my loyalty. Mr. Jarrett smiled obsequiously. I will go immediately to find the owner and brokerage the purchase of the Serendipity. Well, then I'd say everyone's loyalty has a price, and I'm confident to say you found mine. Chapter 91. Portsmouth, February 1799. The Serendipity sailed into Portsmouth on the 1st of February, 1799. There was a small crowd of people who had braved the cold weather and the incessant sleet, who gathered to see the arrival of the grand ship and her owners, who had already amassed significant speculation throughout the town of London society. Their curiosity was piqued by the story of how the new owners insisted on paying the asking price for the Sinclair house, and then spent a similar fortune in order to refurnish the entire Grand Palace. It was the same harbor Anna had left almost 20 years ago, bound for a desolate rock on the other side of the world, to help build a penal colony not yet established. It seemed no busier to her today than the day she left. Not that she had spent much time above the deck on that day. She pulled on her minx jacket to keep the cold, wet wind out. She thought how the weather seemed to acknowledge her sentiment faultlessly. Her mind transported by the images of the harbor to the day she left, all those years ago. Anna was left feeling a simultaneous sense of achievement and of great loss. She had been banished to exile by a man eviler than the devil, and had overcome that to return as one of the richest women in Europe. But she had lost her 2 sons in the process, who now, she hoped, would be grown-up gentlemen in their own rights. Even with the extensive efforts her wealth could afford, no amount of research seemed to discover what happened to them. Jerry Parker, Q.C., and co-owner of Parker and Constantine law firm of London, assured her with her financial backing they would soon determine the whereabouts of her children, but all legal means had failed to provide her answers. He, along with a multitude of other fools, had met her at the wharf. She was tortured by the fear Sir Robert Williams broke his promise to retrieve her boys, and instead left them to rot, confined in Matthew's secret basement. Even the threat of them being raised in his coal mines was better than that. Somehow, she was going to find out what happened to them. She could even live without achieving her revenge on Sir Williams, but she needed to know her boys had been very well. It was crazy, and she knew it. After nearly 15 years, they would be grown men, or they would be dead. But in her mind, she was desperate to at least find out if they had escaped from the underground confines in which she had left them. She crossed the gangplank and stepped onto British soil for the first time in 15 years. A man in a suit offered her his hand as she crossed. She took it patiently. Inwardly, she laughed at the concept that Jack knew her so well. He wouldn't have even offered her his hand with the knowledge she was more than capable by herself. "Thank you, good sir." "You're welcome, my lady." Jack smiled as he walked quietly beside her. He had been much more anxious than her about returning to England. After all, she had already been sentenced and served her time abroad. He, on the other hand, knew there were still many who would wish him dead. Still, as she watched him interact, she knew he was reveling in the grandeur of his new life. This, she realized, was the way he envisioned himself in his many fantasies as a poor boy growing up on the streets of London's West End. A horse-drawn carriage that had recently been purchased for them for their use, while they resided in London, waited on the cobblestone path that met the wharf. "Welcome to Great Britain, Mrs. Layton." It was the ostler who greeted her. He seemed cheerful and courteous, yet at the same time apprehensive of his new masters, who had spent so much money. "I'm Mr. Carmichael, at your complete service, Mrs. Layton." "Thank you, Carmichael." "Good morning, Mr. Layton." A weedy, pale man with a slight hump that appeared to be formed through a lifetime of examining writings all too small, and with a thick monocle, approached Jack. "My name is Donald Forgery, and I'm the head of the Bank of England. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your inquiries with us, and advise you I am here to provide you with any assistance you may require. Given your relationship with our bank, I thought it best I personally greet you." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Forgery. But right now we are tired from our journey and will meet you as per our appointment first thing Monday morning." Jack was curt, but not rude to the man, as he climbed into the coach. Anna was happy to see the door of the coach close behind him. "Mr. Carmichael, drive on," Jack said. Alone in the luxury coach, Anna was pleased to be leaving the crowd behind. It was the first time since they had arrived at Portsmouth she and Jack had been alone together. "Well, Anna, what do you think?" Jack gave her the mischievous grin she so adored. "Are we going to be able to survive this charade until the prey is caught and your revenge extracted?" "I certainly hope so." It took 16 hours to reach London. The only stops were in Petersfield and Guildford to change the horses. At the end of the trip, they came to a relatively flat area. The spiraling city of London could be seen in the distance. It was the largest house either of them had ever seen, and only slightly smaller than their nearest neighbor's estate, owned by the king. Chapter 92. The Sinclair house, which they had purchased, was as ostentatious as it was enormous, boasting 48 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, a large ornamental moat and a lake which had recently been moved so it could be better viewed from Anna's drawing room. There were over 40 hectares of perfectly manicured garden, deemed the height of decadence for those planning on entertaining London's social elite. There was a little stone cottage on the property, used to house the army of gardeners, while the servants slept in the rabbit warren of bedrooms under the house. The throng of people required to keep the grand estate alive had formed a parade out the front of the estate. The butler, Mr. John Horace, patiently introduced the head of each section. It was a long process after their painful journey from Portsmouth, but a formality neither Anna nor Jack knew of any excuse to avoid. She studied the multitude of faces. They were all different, some very young and unsure of themselves, others who looked as though they had been employed in the service of the aristocracy for longer than she had been alive. For the most part, they had genuine smiles on their faces. There were a few whose smiles looked forced. As she inspected each of them, she noticed they were examining her and Jack as much, if not more, as well. Their faces revealed their curiosity for what type of person would purchase this type of estate, and then employ an entire workforce to maintain it for almost a year prior to their arrival. For a moment, Anna had to work hard to withhold the laughter at the concept that until very recently each of these people standing before her would have been higher in social standing than herself. Eventually, the introduction was complete, and the servants were allowed to return to their duties, and they themselves were able to inspect their purchase. As Anna and Jack explored the mansion, she realized, were the house for any other purpose, she would not have chosen it. Nor would she have ever enjoyed being a wealthy socialite. These things did little to interest her. She had found herself happy with little but a good family when she had been married to Matthew. And again, she was content, struggling to survive in the new colony at Sydney Cove. But as an idle lady of leisure, she doubted very much she would ever be satisfied. As it was, she had nothing to worry about, because all the opulence and grandeur was there to catch the attention of Sir Robert Williams. They both agreed the house was perfect for their purpose, but did rather little to pique their interests otherwise, and a substantially smaller house would be much more to their liking. She considered the only exception to this was the extravagant botanical garden with plants cultivated from all sides of the globe. It was self-indulgence, but it was the most appealing decadence she found, because it gave her a fully gated secret sanctuary for her to explore on her own. That night they ate a meal that matched the opulence of the house, then slept soundly in a grand bed. They had adjoining bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, wardrobe, and servants. But they were happy to remain sleeping in the same bed together, They always slept better when they were together. The next day, Jack informed her he was off to a meeting with the chief executive of the Bank of England and might not be back until that afternoon. She kissed him goodbye on his lips. It would have been considered a most inappropriate display of affection in London society, but as Anna noticed the smirk on one of the maids' faces, no older than 15, she decided they could get away with a few things in their own home, at the very least. She waited until he had been gone for 15 minutes. Then she opened the front door and headed into town to meet a dangerous man whom she knew to be of a very bad character. Chapter 93. Anna stared at the front door of number 10 Newham Street for 15 minutes before knocking on it. She was amazed by how little it had changed in the 20 years since she had left it so abruptly. Her life had been so happy and so simple when she lived there. Today she was not wearing any one of her many expensive fine dresses. Instead, she had gone down to the servants' room on the bottom floor and borrowed an outfit from one of the young kitchen hands. After no response, she took the steel bar and pried open the door. "Hello? Is anyone home?" Her resilience to continue was fortified by the silence, and she entered the house and closed the door again. The inside of the house hadn't changed much either. The new occupants appeared just as poor as she had been. This was not the time to reminisce, and she made her way to just under the stairs until her hand could reach the brick wall behind it. There, she slid it down until a brick moved just slightly. She took the iron bar firmly in her right hand again and struck it against the little gap in the mortar of the brick. Once positioned there, she pried down until the brick gave way. It made a loud clunk sound when it hit the ground. Her heart raced as she reached her hand further into the vault behind the brick. She took a deep breath of peace when at last her hand grasped the small pouch. The weight of it told her no one else had found it. She put it in her pocket and confidently walked out the door and down the street. Hours later, she considered the occupants of the house would return to find their house had been broken into, but the burglar stole nothing. Anna felt the joy of having risked something with success. She shouldn't have done it, really. She knew better. The 100 gold sovereigns were worth nothing compared to the money she and Jack now had at their disposal. But Jack would have noticed immediately if she had taken some of it. And then, how could she have told him she needed the money to investigate his past? Why am I investigating the only man whom I have loved to the point of death? She struggled to answer the question on any reasonable grounds. He had told her he had been orphaned early in life and had become a thief before being picked up by a good Samaritan who trained him to become a jeweler. Then, after some honest success in life, he had lost a bet with Sir Robert Williams and lost more than he could repay. Consequently, Sir Williams made him return to his world of thievery and perform one last major theft, the outcome of which had left him running for his life, whereupon they first had met. The diamond itself justified the validity of his story. The story seemed reasonable, and he had no reason to lie. After all, he had admitted to being a good-for-nothing thief. But somehow, the story seemed linked to Matthew. She had no reason to doubt Jack, but for some reason she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow they were all connected. Why else would Sir Robert Williams have had Matthew killed? She walked to Whitechapel, where a man, as was befitting the poor suburb, was drinking beer at a public place. Despite looking like a rough man, the man greeted her with a cordiality that seemed more befitting an old friend than a hired criminal. "Anna, my dear, you're just as beautiful as I remember you." "And you're just as ugly a bastard as ever you were." She smiled charmingly at him. "But it's nice to see you, Henry." She had known him since she was a little girl. As neighbors, they had played together. When she was just 10 years old, they had practiced kissing each other. She had even fancied herself in love with him. He had never asked her out, and they never went further than kissing, but they had maintained some form of relationship. Where her life had gone well, his had been hard. But he knew how to fight and how to learn things. She had often imagined he would have been a good lawyer if his parents had the money for his education. As it was, they were not wealthy, and the only education he ever received was how to fight with his fists, and anything else he could get his hands on. He had naturally turned to solving other people's problems, many of them with simpler, less legal solutions. "I've been wondering when you'd show up, so I have." "So, you got my letter, I see." "Yes, I see a lot has changed for you since I last seen you." "It's been 20 years since they killed Matthew." Speaking about it didn't bring back any bad memories. She had loved the man dearly and mourned for him at the time, but that was a long time ago. And now it was important to keep her promise to herself, to get revenge and help her sons. "I was sorry to hear it, really I was. And then when I discovered they had sentenced you to exile, I had half a mind to kill Sir Williams myself, so I had." She laughed at that. "Thank you, but I'm glad you didn't. That pleasure will be mine one day." "So it will be." He smiled warmly at her. "I really believe you're serious, aren't you?" "Yes. Is that why you came today?" "No, that I can do on my own. That I need to do on my own." She looked into his dark blue eyes. Despite the many scars on his face, he was still handsome, and he had a kindly voice that was used to being listened to when he spoke. She had never forgotten her childish crush. He would always be there for her, so long as she could pay his fee. "Well?" he asked. She handed him the money in a small pouch. "I need you to find out about my husband's past. His real name is Jack Overton." Chapter 94. The warm weather that followed spring had made him long to go for a ride. It was the first time since he had started at Eton that Thomas had taken Spencer, a black stallion, out for a ride for the sheer pleasure of it. Lost in the pleasure of the day, he was stirred by the dark clouds coming in from the north. There was a tremendous storm coming. The unusually warm air was about to strike a cold change, and he had a feeling this was going to be a bad one. His first thought was he should ride back to Harlow, no more than an hour's ride to the north. The only alternative, he considered, would be to ride through the Waltham forest, a thought that excited him as much as it frightened him. Waltham Forest was an ancient woodland in southeast England, straddling the border between northeast Greater London and Essex. It lay on a ridge between the valleys of the rivers Lee and Roding. The forest itself was 12 miles from north to south, but no more than 2.5 miles from east to west. Thomas's father had told him many stories about highwaymen and bands of robbers who took refuge in the forest. The dense tree cover and the forest's closeness to London made it ideal for criminals. As a magistrate, his father had warned him of the risks of entering such a place. Even with an armed guard, the risk is great. By yourself, It is being stupid. He knew his father would be mad if he discovered he had taken the shortcut. But how would he find out? Given the time, and had the weather not been deteriorating, he would have ridden to the north of the forest and then around it. But now he considered riding across the forest. It was no more than 2 miles wide, and he had one of the fastest, strongest war horses money could buy. For years he had considered if Waltham Forest was full of highwaymen. Then no one would attempt to rob a horseman using its trails. After all, he would most likely be a fellow highwayman himself. He made the decision to go against his father. Thoughts of consequence were the least of his concern as he kicked Spencer into a canter. Spencer, his gelding, was bred for war. He was both enormous, 20 hands tall — there were few larger beasts out there — and he was fast. Thomas had owned him since he was a boy, and the two animals had developed together as rider and horse into adulthood. Both still enjoyed the recklessness of youth. After an hour into the trail, he slowed to a walking pace along the river, not much more than a creek, where the two sloping sides of the valley met. Spencer's nose snorted, and Thomas could see the steam from his nostrils. He patted the back of his horse's neck reassuringly. "I know, I don't exercise you enough now that I'm at Eton. I promise we'll try and do this more often." Spencer gave a loud neigh of approval. They approached a small clearing before the river, where others had cleared the dense forest to reach the bank. Spencer's head naturally motioned toward the river. "Very well, boy, let's have a drink." Thomas scouted the area for any signs of bandits. It went against his better judgment to stop in the forest, but he had been riding Spencer hard, and he would need watering if he was to make the journey all the way home. He let Spencer's head bend down and drink the cold water. He snorted again, this time in approval. The water looked delicious, and Thomas couldn't help himself but to dismount and fill his own bottle with the cold, clear water. His attentive ears heard nothing but the soft flow of the river and the leisurely bubble of his bottle as it filled with water. He mounted Spencer again, and, relieved to be in a much better position to escape, drank from his bottle. It tasted as good as it looked. Clipping the lid on again, he leaned forward to stow the bottle. He never even saw the arrow. For a second, he didn't even realize what had happened. While he bent down, he heard the sound it made as it whirled past where his head had been a second previously. He had made a life-threatening mistake coming into the forest. Shit! We're in trouble! He hadn't even noticed the man who had crept up in front of him with a knife. Suddenly, Spencer gave an enormous, high-pitched neigh and reared its front legs, nearly throwing him off the saddle in the process, and crushing the man with his powerful front hooves. "Quick, boy, get us out of this!" His legs instinctively gripped the stirrups harder, and his hand slapped twice, the way he did when he wanted to go faster. He made his way further down the trail, away from the source of the arrow. He had no way of knowing how many people were after him. The trail followed the bank of the stream for 300 feet, then dropped down as the valley fell away further. If he could make it to the next dense section of forest, he would be safe from arrows, providing his pursuers were on foot. They could never keep up with him while he was riding Spencer. In the distance, a tree had fallen over the tracks, at the point where the path fell away, further down the steep valley. There was no time to see what was on the other side. Thomas continued toward the tree at a gallop. Another arrow whistled past Spencer's head. It was just the right amount of motivation for the beast, and he ran at the tree with all his might. At the last minute he jumped. They cleared it with ample room. The path dropped steeply on the other side of the fallen tree. They landed with a jarring force. Spencer didn't need to be told to keep running and kept galloping down the steep slope. Thomas had never ridden him so hard before. He was starting to enjoy himself. It was that kind of crazy pleasure that came after you find yourself alive, after resigning yourself to die. Thomas turned his head just long enough to be relieved to see his pursuers were no longer following. He didn't even see the man swing the club at him. Thomas was thrown backwards off his horse and landed onto the soft, muddy ground. Spencer, unknowing, didn't even pause, and Thomas watched as his horse ran off without him. Unsaddled, he knew he was now in trouble. "Boy, you've sure taken the wrong turn, haven't you?" The man had long hair and was missing a number of teeth. "What do you want from me?" Thomas, young though he was, knew exactly what the man wanted. His only thought was how to give it to him without getting killed. "I think we both know what I want." Thomas didn't have to be asked twice. He took out his gold timepiece, his wallet, which held a number of pound notes, and placed them both in his hat. "I'm sorry, son. We're going to have to ask for your boots, too." By this stage, the other bandits had caught up. He did as he was told, reluctantly. "Now I'd like your riding shirt and trousers. I never owned a gentleman's riding clothes. You're near enough to my size. I'll have them." He started to object, and one of the bigger men quickly came and placed a knife at his throat. "Do I really need to insist?" Thomas didn't need more persuasion. With the sound of his beating heart in his head, he slowly stripped until he was left in nothing more than his breeches, worried about what he had left to give the violent men. "Those look comfortable for sleeping in. I'll have those too." Standing there, as naked as the day he was born, Thomas tried to remain confident. If he was going to die, he wanted to do so as a gentleman, no groveling. "Well, gentlemen, it appears I have nothing more to offer you. Now, your horse killed my brother back there, so there's the matter of payment." Thomas didn't say anything. "Hold him, boys." He turned to run, but they had already gotten a hold on him. He fought desperately, but the three people who held him were much stronger. "Tie him up. Let's hang the rich bastard." Thomas struggled vainly while they placed the noose over his head and threw the other side up over a branch. "Is this how it's going to end for me?" A tall man, dressed in fine clothing befitting a nobleman, then calmly walked up to the four outlaws. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." Thomas noticed a strange look of surprise on their wicked and fetid faces. The man didn't wait for their response. He drew 2 dueling pistols from his belt and shot 2 of them in the head. The third man had just enough distance and time to draw his arrow as far back as his ear. His powerful shoulder made the movement appear effortless. A seasoned archer. The arrow never left the bow. The stranger had pulled out a long rifle and shot him dead too. Thomas had looked into purchasing a commission with an experimental regiment called the 95th Riflemen, in which a Baker rifle was used. Its spiraling barrel allowed for precision shooting at a distance where a musket could never. The rifle the man before him used appeared to be of a much finer quality, a brand he'd never seen before. It appeared to have been crafted with the fine work of a master armorer. The fourth bandit then emerged from where he'd taken refuge behind a tree. He had a pistol in his hand. "Well, you're a cheating bastard, you are." The nobleman didn't wait. He picked up a dagger from the dead man's belt and in one quick movement threw it at the remaining villain. It struck home in the man's throat. The man had such a puzzled look on his face. He went to say something that resembled "why," but only the gurgle of blood in his windpipe came out. Then he fell forward and was dead. The nobleman walked up to the dead man, withdrew the knife from his throat, and cut Thomas free from the noose. "My God, that was amazing!" Thomas looked at the stranger, who was abroad without a winter jacket, but dressed in clothes that displayed the wealth of a nobleman. "Are you hurt?" The man casually started to reload his pistols and his rifle. "No. Other than my pride, I'll be fine." Thomas quickly redressed. "That's never a bad thing for a young man. You know, you shouldn't ride through this part of the woods. Didn't you know it's well known to be occupied by thieves?" "Yes, my father told me before. He's going to be furious with me when he finds out." "Well, I don't see any reason why he must find out, do you?" "No, you're right." Thomas's horse returned to him and gently nuzzled his face sympathetically. "We'd better be off before any more of their lot come." "I agree." And with those words, young Thomas rode further into the forest with the most frighteningly dangerous stranger he'd ever met. Chapter 95. The Goldman Club was the kind of place that catered to the ultra-rich gentlemen of London. Any pleasure a wealthy man may want could be obtained from such a club. Their every fantasy provided for. Few people had the means or the reputation to obtain entry to such a place. Jack had both the financial means and the reputation the Goldman Club was renowned for. He came in and sat down at a table alone. An obsequious waiter came and asked what he'd like. He requested a glass of the club's best whiskey. The man came back within the minute and asked him if he wanted it the way he normally does. He nodded his head, and the waiter poured the 4 ice-cold stones into the drink. In doing so, the drink could be cooled without diluting its content with melting ice. He had a drink. It was unblended, single-barrel bourbon from America, and excellent. It would have cost a fortune anywhere else. Here, all drinks and food, always of the very best quality, were free to the few who could afford to delight in such extravagant pleasures, in which the club specialized. Jack reflected on the events of 2 days ago in the woods. He wasn't worried about killing all 4 of the men. After all, they were all murderers, even if he was the one to offer them money to kill the young boy. It had surprised him how young the boy appeared. After all, he was 17 and had recently started studying at Eton. The cocky little shit tried to ride straight through the Waltham forest. A little part of him liked the kid for his confidence, even if it had been unwarranted. He sat there, sipping his drink as he watched, in the distance, a man in a dark suit playing baccarat with his newfound young friend, Thomas. The game being played was for big money, and within an hour of Jack's arrival he could see Thomas was in deep. It was a common mistake for young gentlemen to risk outside their means. Somehow, it always seemed to be worse the richer the young man's fathers were. Thomas certainly seemed to be proving that true. The man in the black suit picked up his top hat. It was time, Jack realized. He casually walked over to the table. Immediately, he could see the sweat on Thomas's forehead. The poor kid had run out of his luck. "I wonder how much he'll fight for his honor as a gentleman." "Will you accept a letter of reimbursement?" Thomas asked the gentleman. "Are you telling me you can't afford to pay what you owe me?" The man didn't raise his voice. Instead, he did something much worse in a place such as the Goldman Club. He became indignant. "I thought I got away from these sorts of problems by being at a place like this." "I can afford to pay, good sir." Thomas tried to put on his most outraged voice at the implication that he was unable to pay his dues. "I just don't have it on me right now. Is tomorrow night acceptable to you?" "No, tomorrow night is not acceptable for me." The man then turned to 2 people in fine suits, who were presumably part of the club's vast security personnel. I must inform the young gentleman failure to make payment will require the matter to be put forth to the police." The color drained from Thomas's face. As a gentleman's son, no worse fate could be afforded. Jack watched as the boy struggled to find a solution to his predicament. "My dear lady, can you please withdraw from my account however much is owing to Mr. Jack looked at the man dressed in black for want of a name. "Mr. Felix," the man filled him in. "As you wish, Mr. Layton," said the lady of the house. "Ah, yes. Can you please have such money as this gentleman was left wanting transferred immediately to Mr. Felix? My apologies for the young gentleman. I am certain this has all been a big mix-up, and he will rectify the accounts with me shortly." He then looked at Thomas. "Won't you?" "Yes, of course." He then attempted to justify his mistakes, but Jack cut him short. "These things happen, my good man. It is not worth troubling oneself over such small accounts." Mr. Felix, then, having been paid his fortune, bid everyone good evening and left the club. Jack was about to leave himself when Thomas came up to him again. "Mr. Layton, I can't begin to tell you how grateful I am for your service. I will repay you all of it, I promise." "Ah, but we are neighbors now. You mustn't mention it any more." "Twice, in so many days, you have arrived at just the point I found myself in need of such assistance." "As I have said, these are simple matters to resolve as gentlemen such as ourselves. I bid you good evening, Thomas." Happy with the success of his night, Jack put on his coat and his top hat and walked out the door. By the time he was 2 blocks down the road, the man who had previously identified himself as Mr. Felix came to greet him. The small, beady man came and placed a bag of coins in front of him. "This will be yours then, boss?" Jack smiled politely. "No, you keep it. It was the kid's money anyway. Call it a bonus for working so well." Chapter 96. Jack woke the next morning to Anna's affectionate nudging. "I need to see him again. I want to go." "But he'll recognize you the instant he sees you." "It has been more than 12 years. How could he remember me?" "It could have been 100 years, and he would recognize you the instant you walked through our doors." "Then we'll have to make it a masked ball." It was not the first argument they'd had since arriving in London. Jack had found himself ever more frustrated. They had not made love more than a handful of times in the 3 months since they had arrived in London. They were here for a purpose, but that purpose was not a happy one, and for every day that went by without Anna discovering the whereabouts of her sons, the unhappier they became. "Well, Jack, what do you think of the boys?" Anna asked. Jack's lips parted in a smile. "I've only met the one so far." "Very well. So what's he like?" "The older boy, Thomas? He strikes me as very young, but his manners are impeccable, and he was entirely more gracious than I expected. He displays none of the condescension his father has to those beneath him. He is currently studying at Eton, and from what I've seen I have no doubt he would be a good scholar. He holds an irrelevant commission with the 95ths. I believe they're some sort of experimental regiment that uses the new Baker's rifle. He's completely useless in a fight, but makes up for it with the bravery of a man far better than his father." Jack paused as though he was considering if there was anything else to tell her about the boy. "Oh, he'll never make a decent baccarat player, and like all boys of his condition, will gamble far more than he has. Bereft of any sense for the value of money, his greatest fear when he looked to be bankrupted was admitting to his father he lost it all." "And you're his latest hero?" "I certainly am. but I'm not entirely comfortable ruining his life for the sake of avenging his father." "Well, I have no problem with it. I told you before, you may not have the stomach for this fight. If that's the case now, you may depart to your beloved Americas and leave me to it." "I'm not happy about the arrangement, nor do I wish to leave you, ever. It is strange just how far one's love will lead you away from what you believe to be right." "What about the other boy?" "I haven't met him yet. I hear he's currently vacationing in France for the summer." She sipped at her drink and relaxed back in her chair. "So, the boy will be simple. But what are we going to do about the father?" "I think I've worked out a solution." "Please tell me." "We shall bankrupt him too." She laughed at this concept. "That I would like to see, but you're forgetting he is a very rich man." "But we are much richer. We will lead him down a path of debt for the sake of investment, and then artificially inflate prices by purchasing the stock, so he gets greedy. When he has borrowed more than he can spare to lose, we will sell everything at a massive loss and bankrupt him in the process." "It won't be easy. Sir Robert Williams is supposed to be abjectly against speculation. Having been born into a fortune, the concept of others improving their position in life is hard for him to grasp." "Ah, but what we shall do is make his friends richer, until it stings at his human need to want what others have." "But how can you be certain he would go through with it?" Anna looked doubtful. "After all, he is already very rich. Why would he risk losing it all?" "Because, Anna, I have never met a rich man who doesn't want to be richer." Chapter 97. Thomas said, "You should have seen him, Father. He didn't even flinch." Sir Williams continued reading his newspaper as he sat down in the morning tea-room and ignored the comment for a little while, much more interested in the prices of coal, which was listed for the day in the London Times. Thomas, he noticed, unperturbed by his disinterest, continued telling his spiel to his little brother, whose eyes appeared wide as he listened to every breath of the story. He was animatedly retelling some sort of anecdote by the sound of things. He lowered the newspaper just enough so he could look directly at the older boy. "Seen whom? Do what?" "Mr. Leighton, our neighbor." "Oh, what has he done now?" "He rescued me." Sir Williams listened as Thomas retold his story about being set upon by armed thieves and nearly killed were it not for Mr. Leighton. No detail of the event was spared. He listened to the entire story without saying a word, and at the end said, "Well, I hope that has taught you a valuable lesson about riding through any forest alone. I would think a man of your breeding would have better sense." "Yes, I mean, of course I have learned my lesson." Thomas shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. He'd evidently wished he'd been more discreet in the telling of his story, and then continued on. "But what did you think about the part of my rescue?" Thomas's eyes glowed with the hero worship of the youth. "Don't you think Mr. Leighton was a hero? Everyone seems to be in awe of this man. Just the other day I heard some fool going on about how he made his fortune through investments. You know how I feel about speculation. I hope you remember he is new money, not one of us." "Yes, of course I do, Father." The last word was emphasized, like an admonished child's surrender to authority. "Can't we make an exception in this circumstance? Because even though it is new, it really does seem to be most vast. Darling, the boy seems quite taken by the man. The least we should do is attend his ball and thank the man for rescuing Thomas." "Thank you, Mother." The words flowed off his mouth to Robert's pleasure. "He's throwing a ball." It was evidently the first Thomas had heard about it. "Can we please attend, Father?" "I can see I'm not going to win this one. Very well." He opened up his newspaper, and the discussion was deemed finished. He read a story about the effects the French Revolution had on the value of the franc, and hoped this didn't affect the Bank of England too much. There would be a ripple there, of course, but hopefully not too large of one. Williams was just about to close the paper when he read an article about how the Venice Bank and the Bank of England were both trying to offer Jack Layton, who was considered to be the greatest investment banker in all of the known world, a position. The article showed Jack, although flattered by the request, had politely declined the offer, stating he was happy to leave the corrupt world of finance. Oh, for goodness sake. The world's gone mad. First the French Revolution gets rid of its royalty and aristocracy, and now the rest of Europe has placed this nobody on one giant pedestal because he made a few lucky speculations. Sir Williams closed the newspaper and walked out the door, and the trap was laid. Chapter 98. Anna retired from the party early, but she was pleased to see it had been a big success. Chefs had been brought in from both France and Italy, where many of the best had been trained. Nothing was left wanting. The best food, wine, and music were all there. The London Orchestra were set up on a specially built stage on the lake and played all the classics as well as some of the more modern music, most excellent for dancing. She laughed as she recalled Belinda's discussion about speculation. Mr. Robertson had been talking very animatedly to Mrs. Williams in regard to the advice Jack had given him. "Yes, well, that's all very good, and I'm glad that it worked out so splendid for you, but I'm quite certain our dear Mr. Williams would not even consider the risk, because you know how much he detests speculation," Belinda had said. Sir Williams walked in at that point. A cane in his left hand aided him as he walked. He could walk perfectly without it, but his wife told her that he tended to play more on his age when it came to balls, so as to avoid the inevitable confrontation that followed his refusal to dance. "What is it that I detest so much?" "Speculation, my dear." "Yes, of course. Well, I am a man of good breeding and sense. But why do you speak of such vile things tonight?" "Well, it's only that Mr. Shane Robertson here has recently been given some very sound advice on the value of steamships by none other than Mr. Layton. And now he has made thrice his original value in return." "Yes, well, that was very fortunate of him, but I dare say that was all it was, and nothing about sound investment either. You wouldn't ever catch me doing such a silly thing." "It always strikes me as very amusing you don't look twice at a man who has inherited his fortune through his birthright, whereas a man who has made his wealth through his own efforts is untrustworthy," Anna had challenged him. "Yes, that's exactly how I see it. God chooses those who should be in power and those who should be slaves. A man who makes his own fortune is going directly against God himself." "Well, if that is the way you see it, God must be very displeased with Jack here. He was born a very poor man." She could see the glimmer of irritation on Sir William's face. "My apologies. These are not discussions to be had at a party. I must go and check up on the other guests." "Good evening," he had said with a politeness she did not feel. Later that night, she and Belinda had started talking while the men retired to more wines and cigars. Belinda mentioned something about the current unrest at one of their coal mines, Glenfield, just north of London. The stupid little do-gooders keep wanting to stop the use of children in the mine. Honestly, how could anyone afford to run a mine if they didn't use children? She had said. But, of course, the human rights people don't even consider how much it costs to run a mine. If you couldn't use children, then the price of coal would have to go up. And then no one would have coal to run their fires, and London would be a very sad place then, wouldn't it? Anna agreed, and they both had a good laugh about how simple people could be. Anna then knew where her next journey must be. Chapter 99. Glenfield was nestled between two large mountain ranges, creating a pass in the north of London's outer regions. The outside of the mine looked very tidy and almost picturesque in the way it nestled into the side of the valley, a creek meandering down the middle. Anna had heard about the grotesque conditions in such mines, but what she saw in front of her appeared quite nice. A facade? She wondered. Which hides the actual evils of the mine? A dam had been built further up the valley, and piping ran from it to the entrance of the mine. The coal itself was piled further down the hill, a few 100 feet from the entrance. As a precaution, Mr. Benton told her to ensure a fire did not destroy the entire mine and stock of coal. Mr. Benton was a man who appeared to be in his early 40s, but looked much older. A lifetime working in the mines had made him tough as they come. He seemed flattered by her interest in the mine. He told her about how he was a 4th-generation miner. His parents had indentured him to Sir William's father for 10 quid at birth to mine the coal into perpetuity. The pay was poor, but it was all he'd ever done. Many people had protested the system, but he was happy enough with it. After all, it was what God had wanted. He then talked about how he had made it to the top position as foreman and would happily live out the remainder of his days working for Sir William's, if the mine remained productive. She asked about her boys, but he said he didn't recall any by their descriptions. He was quick to add that more than 1,000 orphans had come through Sir William's mines since he was a boy himself. Anna felt disheartened. But I know someone who might know. He no longer works here, but he has a hut at the end of Sir William's land. It's only a couple miles from here, and he's been around longer than any other man I know. The first Williams was around when he first started here. Robert's father? No, his grandfather. He's been around that long. Does he still remember much? Says he never forgets a face. Knows everything about everyone. If your boys were ever here, he'll know about them. He was foreman before me. She decided to make the journey. It took just over an hour. His house was no bigger than any shack she and Jack had lived out of in New South Wales. Some reward, after a lifetime of work for an evil family, but it had a nice outlook over the Williams' rural land. The man looked like he could be 100. She doubted he could remember anything, but she'd made the journey, so she might as well talk to the man. Mr. Benton introduced them and then left. Mr. Turner, Sir Robert Williams sent me to exile 12 years ago, and when I told him my children would be orphaned, he told me not to worry because he would send them to his mines. Their names were Joey, he would have been a baby then, and his brother John, 4. The man didn't even think about it. They were never sent here. The man spoke quietly and without any haste, as though he still had all the time in the world to speak to a pretty woman. There was a certainty in his voice. "How can you be so certain? There must have been literally thousands of people brought through the mines in the time you've been here."
"Yes, and I looked after them all. I knew every orphan, every child, and every adult who came through here, and there were never two little brothers."
"None?"
"Not one. Not since that evil boy Robert took over. He never accepted brothers in his mine. I don't know what he planned to do with them. Always happy to take a single boy or girl, but never brothers. No one ever dared ask him about it. But if you ask me, I think it has to do with what he did to his poor brother. It really rattled his brain, you know."
"What do you mean? I didn't even know Robert had a brother."
"Well, no one knows for sure, but it all has to do with him not being the first in line to inherit the Williams fortune."
He then relayed the entire known story about William's little brother going missing. When he was done, he said to her,
"The boy's alive somewhere, and Robert knows it. 12 years ago, something happened which brought it all back to the surface. Robert changed somehow, and I think he's been trying to make amends."
"Thanks for your help."
"I'm sorry I wasn't more help."
He then smiled kindly at her and said,
"Find the brother. He might know where your boys were sent."
Chapter 100. She had planned to make the journey in one day, but this news kept her there longer than she had expected, and in the end, it didn't seem safe to return in the dark. She knew Jack would worry, but there was nothing she could do about it. The next day, she reached their London estate by lunchtime. "Where have you been?" It wasn't like Jack to be so dependent on her. "Looking for my boys. Where else do I go?" She was quick to react to his implication. "I thought I'd talk to the foreman at Glenfield, but he didn't know of anyone like my boys. Besides, I thought you weren't going to be back here for another day or two. Weren't you supposed to be introducing poor Thomas to the delights of sin and corruption?" "Yes, well, he's a quick learner there." He seemed calmer already, and sat down to pour himself a glass of wine. "He is he?" She was pleased. Eager to drink himself to ruin, quick to respond to a challenge, terrible at baccarat, and completely ignorant of the consequences of losing more than one can afford to pay. They enjoyed lunch together, and then Jack had to leave. No sooner had he left than Henry turned up. "Can we go for a walk somewhere, Anna? Somewhere we can talk alone?" They went for a walk along the river that flowed behind her gardens. The salmon could be seen jumping out of the flowing water, while they attempted their once-in-a-lifetime journey upriver to spawn. Finally, when they were far enough away, Henry related what he had found. When he was done, he stopped walking to look at her face and said, "Anna, do you realize what this means?" "Yes, of course I do. It was before me all along. I knew something just didn't match up. I tried to tell myself to forget it, but I just couldn't. I prayed I was wrong, and that I was wasting my time talking to you, but in my heart I knew there was something. What are you going to do now?" "I don't know, but God damn it, if this is true, I can't believe the world is such a horrible place." Chapter 101. On the 21st of April, 1798, Sarah gave birth to a girl. It was a difficult labor, and they couldn't afford a doctor, so a woman from down the road, who'd had almost a dozen of her own, offered to help guide her through the process. The child came out with her feet first, a dangerous process the woman knew to be called breeching, but had never before seen. In the end, David had been required to pull with all his strength to release the poor child from its hold. He had been terrified the entire time he would literally rip its head off. In the end, the child did eventually come into the world. It looked a lot worse than he remembered his other two children when they were born all those years ago. It had such a hard time of it at first, he thought her dead. But then she started to breathe. Then she cried, and soon she took to her mother's tit, and Michelle, the woman from down the road, told him it was all going to be very well. David cried. He stared at the little creature with the elation only a new father could appreciate. She was the most precious, beautiful thing in his entire life. He had loved his boys dearly too, but the order of the truth had then been his most valuable loyalty. This time, it would be different. Now, as her dark blue eyes, not yet aware of the world around her, looked up at him, he felt all the doubt, all the losses he had endured in his life were all made right by the birth of this living creature. Thoughts of revenge were lost. Thoughts of the loss of his beautiful Anna were forgotten. His hatred for Sir Robert's, a distant memory. For he had a new love that could replace them all. "She's beautiful, Davy," her mother said, as the two of them looked at her contorted face. "She's like her mother, and I will love you both for the rest of my life." For the first time since he discovered Anna had been living in New South Wales, so close to him all these years, he felt content. He had a baby girl, and Sarah, her beautiful mother, whom he'd adored for as long as he could remember. It was time, he decided, to let Anna go from his life and simply be happy. He had all any man could ask for in life. Surely Sarah was right. Anna would have moved on with her life. No reason to ruin whatever she has or start again with his boys, who would now be grown men. He was unable to find out about Anna or his boys, and had given up anyway. For the first time since he had lost his family, he had settled and found himself completely satisfied with his life. It was an enormous weight off his shoulders not to feel so miserable about the loss, and just be happy with what he now had. It was because of this David's heart missed a beat when Anna came walking through his door. Chapter 102. She had aged, but looked no less beautiful than he remembered. Standing before him, her red hair tied back gracefully in the delicate manner in which only a lady's maid could manage. Her pale, soft skin looked a little older and tougher, but no less pure. Her eyes still took his breath away, but there was only a glimmer of her old smile left. The smile was what he'd loved the most. David calculated she must now be approaching 40, and yet she was still remarkable to look at. Sarah was a beautiful girl, and at the age of 28 she was a much younger woman than Anna. But she lacked a certain finesse that Anna exemplified. He went to open his mouth and speak, but a lump in the back of his throat seemed to be rendering such effort impossible. He couldn't yet smile at her either. "Well, Matthew, are you going to say something?" She finally smiled, as her eyes looked him up and down. "Anything, at the very least?" That's the name I haven't heard for many years. Not since the terrible night that changed both our lives forever. He sort of stopped, as if to say, "Well, what did you want me to say?" Then, after a while, he carried on again. I go by the name of David Overton now, as though that explained everything. And Matthew was never really your name, was it? I never knew my real name, after my parents left me for dead in a field in France. He was frustrated. After all this time, the first thing she had to say to him was, he had always been a fake. I can't believe it's you. He smiled at her. He felt both happy to see her again and forlorn at his loss. She could never be his again. I had given up hope of ever seeing you again. Tell me what you did wasn't true? He thought quickly about what she could be referring to. At first, he thought she'd been upset he had found another woman and started a new family. But Anna had always been the more pragmatic of the two of them. If anything, she would have been the first to admit he did the right thing. He then knew exactly what she was talking about. He couldn't answer her. It was answer enough that he didn't deny it, and he looked in her pale green eyes. He could tell she knew that too. She came toward him in a torrent of vehemence and struck him across the face. He didn't flinch, and he didn't bother trying to block her. He felt just as ashamed, and felt he deserved it. The noise was enough to pique Sarah's curiosity in the background. "Who's at the door?" It was his Sarah, only a little concern in her weak voice. "A man who's going to help me find work. I'll be a little while. Are you very well?" "Yes, I'm going back to bed." "Very well. Good night. I'll come back in to check up on you and Elise in a little while." He carefully looked around and then stepped out, quietly closing the front door behind him. "Why?" It was all she said. And even as she said it, he had never seen her look so beautiful and so hurt. She didn't look mad at him, only hurt. He didn't answer immediately. "Tell me why!" she yelled at him. "Shh! My wife has just had a baby and is asleep, for goodness sake. I was your wife once." "Yes, and I loved you, truly. I did. But things have changed now, and there is nothing more I can do about that. I wish it wasn't this way. I really do." She looked visibly calmer to him, as though she had resigned herself to the details of the betrayal, but now wanted to know the truth. "I don't even care any more that it happened, but I have to know why you did it. How can anyone be so believing? I will never know. You owe me that much." He sighed. The resolution of a man who was about to tell his worst secret to the woman he loved. It was the vilest thing he could imagine, far more than the affair. It was having lied to the woman he loved about their life together. "I was orphaned as a child, as you know. I was angry with the world, far too angry, and I spent a lot of time trying to find a way to get even. I found a secret society that offered that instrument of revenge, and I took it. There I was instructed to befriend you because it would assist in my cover. I was to become an expert tailor, although many of the garments I made were in fact made by others for me. In doing so, I would gain access to many aristocrats. I was supposed to do that until I was needed." "So you married me for a stupid boys' club?" "Yes. No, not really." He stumbled as he tried to find the right words for the problem. "I was given you because you could provide me with the complete family I would require to live unnoticed. But then there was a problem." "What was the problem?" "In the end, I fell in love with you." He stared into her dark green eyes. Never before had he wanted more than anything to take this hurt woman into his arms, kiss her, and tell her he was sorry, and it was all going to be very well. But even as he looked at her, the words of the promise he made no more than 15 minutes ago resounded in the back of his mind. "This time, I promise I'll do better for my child." "And then we had children." "Yes, and then we had children, and I was happy. Oh, dear God, but you must believe me. I was ever so happy. I had been given you, but I did love you and both our boys. So then what happened?" The order had determined if it were to be instrumental in the coming of the French and British Revolution, ironically, it was going to need more gold to manage it. One of our members knew of a diamond, the largest, most brilliant diamond ever discovered, in Rhodesia. It was to be made into a perfect jewel for the king, to be given as a gift on the anniversary of his inauguration. It wasn't supposed to be made into anything for another 6 months, but had been guarded in the king's safe. The guard, it turns out, had a predilection for young blonde women. A plan was developed, and it was determined that such a woman would entice the guard to drink with her. She could spike the drink with a little laudanum, and he would sleep until the morning. Who was the woman? Her name was Emily, and she was a sweet girl. Even before her name was out of his lips, he regretted saying it. Were you betting her? He wanted to lie to her, to avoid the truth, but he couldn't. It didn't matter anymore. None of it did. Yes, he closed his eyes. But it was only ever for the cause. The reason seemed feeble, even to himself. Go on. Tell me what happened on the day it all went so horribly wrong. Once we determined the need for the diamond and a method to steal it, we reduced the number of people who knew the exact plans until, in the end, there was myself, the Grandmaster, who I only now presume to have been Sir Robert Williams, and a jeweler who knew the details. The jeweler was supposed to create an exact replica of the diamond. It didn't need to be perfect, but it needed to be good. Then we were going to exchange it. By the time anyone examined it closely enough to determine the truth, we would have been long out of harm's way. So what happened on the day? On the day, we were running late. Maybe only 20 minutes, but that was all the time in the world. The laudanum seemed to take forever to have an effect on the guard. We didn't want to give so much. He wouldn't wake up in the morning at the changing of the guards. Once he was finally out, I had to take his keys to get access to the vault and remove the diamond. It wasn't with the rest of the crown jewels, you see, where we would have never had a chance to access it. Instead, it was waiting to be worked on by the royal jeweler. I grabbed the diamond, and then we quickly left him to sleep, and we made out our way to the other side of the river, where we were to meet our jeweler. He took us out of the boat, said he wanted to examine the diamond more properly in the light. I wasn't happy about it, but what else could I do? He looked at her, and she nodded, as if to say, go on. Emily stayed with the boat, and I went to a place the jeweler had organized before. We didn't take long, and we made the exchange. Once we made the exchange, I started to walk back toward the boat, and that's where I saw a man shoot her. I hid the gold and the diamond in the river's bank and tried to help her, but she was dead before I got to her. I thought I was safe, without the diamond or the gold with me, but instead I had been set up to be arrested. Once arrested, I was never going to be allowed to live. That much was certain. After all that I knew, the Order of the Truth was never going to risk me being alive. I was told you were dead. How did you survive? A friend of mine, one of the guards, who also was a part of the Order of the Truth, exchanged my name with another poor wretch who was to be deported. In the end, he was executed, and I was sent to the penal colony in NSW. I'm sorry, she said. Now I hear you ended up at the penal colony as well. What happened to you and my boys? They must be young gentlemen by now. Are they well? I had made a deal to spare your life with Sir Robert Williams, a deal he didn't uphold, and consequently I was told the next day you had been executed. I struck him in the face so hard his nose bled. He didn't like that, and I believe he was tempted to have me executed too, except I frightened him to the point he decided it best to have me sent away instead. I had left Joey and John at home, and Sir Williams promised he would look after them. But I think that meant sending them to the mines. In New South Wales, I survived for one reason alone, so I could return and avenge you and rescue my boys. Somewhere along the line, Jack became entangled in my life. Jack? That's the name of your jeweler. He's an amoral fool, but he has been kind to me. He helped me escape, and now we've come back to get revenge on Sir Roberts and find the boys. So that's the man I heard you had boarded the ship with. I can't believe, after all that time, you were always there, so nearby to me, and I never knew it. I don't like the man, you know. I didn't trust him when I made the exchange, and I didn't like him when we were working together in the Parramatta farm. I have a good idea he didn't like me either. That was you who had explored the Parramatta River with Jack to discover Rose Hill? Revelations came to her mind at the distant memory of a time long ago. He came back so angry. I'd never seen him in such a state. He said someone else from his past had followed him. Yep, that would have been me. He had started talking more like they used to, when they were husband and wife. So, after all this time, how did you find me? Somehow, deep down, I knew you, Jack, and Sir Robert Williams were all related. I had heard as much as I could from Jack, but somehow I couldn't make the connection. I know it was wrong, but I couldn't help it. So I paid an old friend with limited scruples to find out about Jack's past. And it turns out, Jack was part of the Order of the Truth also. It wasn't a complete coincidence Jack was picked by Williams to make the diamond. I think his role in the Order was far less idealistic and more monetary-driven. He used to make forgeries of letters for the Order. They had intercepted kings' letters, dignitaries' and statesmen's letters. By being able to copy them and manipulate the writings, they could manipulate the future course of nations. That explains it. But how did you discover that? And there's more. What else? Williams goes back further than you realize. I've only known him from the Order of the Truth. Did you ever meet him outside of the society? No. And to be honest, I didn't really know him within the society. I only found out his real name afterward. You see, my only knowledge of him was he was the Grandmaster. So, you don't know what he looks like? No, we wear ornamental gowns when we meet, and I've never met him outside of the meetings. Why do you ask? Because he looks very much like you. What are you saying? I'm saying I've found your brother. It was my own brother who tried to kill me? He asked incredulously. Now what are you going to do? Anna asked nervously. Now that you know the truth? He thought about it for a minute in silence and then said, I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do. In the distance, he watched as a tall man who looked mildly familiar caught his eye, before quickly walking away. Chapter 103. The Goldman Club had become a regular sanctuary for young Thomas. Tonight was relatively warm by London standards, and he was happy to accept a drink when he sat down at the gaming table. Mr. Leighton was already among the few gentlemen who had gathered there tonight. He wasn't too sure what it had been he had been offered, but as was so often the way, he felt it was perfectly reasonable to accept whatever the other much older gentlemen were consuming. Like the thick smoke of their cigars, which burnt at his lungs, he often found the alcohol rather difficult to stomach, until much later in the night. At any event, it had never stopped him enjoying the evening. He played his first hand and lost. For him, like so many others, he felt the problem was more related to bad luck than a lack of skill. He was certain, as Jack continued to hint to him was the case, that his luck would surely turn soon, and that he would win back all his losings. The problem was, his pile of IOUs from Jack seemed to be getting higher and higher, and he began to worry he might never be able to afford to repay them. As the night went on, Thomas seemed to win the majority of the small hands, but then lose the big ones, the consequence of which was forever having to borrow more money. He had become increasingly concerned about how he was going to repay Mr. Leighton for all his IOUs he had stacked up over the weeks since he had first made his acquaintance. Tonight, like so many others, he'd had such terrible luck at the table. He really did wonder why he bothered turning up at all. "I promise. I will one day pay you back. Really, I do intend to." "And I'm sure you will. But please, forget about it for the time being. We are neighbors, and it really is most vulgar to discuss what one owes one another." "But if there is ever anything I can do for you, then I will do everything in my power to achieve it for you." "That's a very honorable thing indeed." "Anything at all," Thomas continued. "Well, to be honest, there's one thing I've been meaning to talk to you about." "Anything at all. Go on." "It's about your father, actually." "My father? Yes. What about him?" Thomas was worried. He didn't have very much to do with his father's business doings. "I have a business proposition for your father." Thomas laughed, at once relieved. This was something he wouldn't have to approach his father about. He could comfortably tell Mr. Leighton this was impossible. "I could approach my father, but I must tell you, it would be useless. My father utterly detests speculation." "And so do I. All real gentlemen do. But you see, I have some insider knowledge that will make us both so rich we will be able to control the kingdom with the might of our own wealth." "Why not make all the money for yourself, then?" Thomas had his first inclination maybe Mr. Leighton's relationship with him was not entirely kindly. "Don't misunderstand me. I do not approach your father with this prospect out of neighbor friendship or altruism. I do so because he is the next richest man I know, and for what I am going to do, I will need that much money." "He would never go for it." "Probably not. But I would like the chance to discuss it with him. Like I said, I have invaluable insider knowledge about a certain company. The risk is very small, and the rewards are enormous." "I'll try my best. I'm not promising anything, and I doubt very much I can persuade him even to meet with you. But if there is a way, I'll find it for you." Chapter 104. Sir Robert Williams sat back in the luxurious leather seat of his study and examined the man who stood before him. He made no attempt at courtesy and didn't offer to let the other man sit. He noted he was a strong man who could have been useful as a laborer or even as a soldier, but never as a gentleman. He felt uncomfortable letting him into the confines of his fine house. Were it not for the way his son pleaded, and the opportunity to show his son once and for all what sort of fool Mr. Leighton really was. He never would have permitted it. He sipped at his wine in an attempt to ease his irritation. "I'll tell you what I tell everyone. Sir Robert Williams does not speculate." "And nor should you. I, for one, would never dream of speculation." "But that's exactly what it is you want me to do with my money, isn't it?" Williams shook his head. "You're all the same. It doesn't matter what you want to call it. Investment, sure thing, looking toward the future. It's all still speculation. Do you think I would have found myself as one of the richest men in Europe if I were merely gambling? Don't you think I'd be bankrupt by now, in debtor's prison?" "I'll give it to you. You're luckier than most, but that's all you are." "No, I'm not just lucky. I'm a cheat." Sir William's ears pricked up at that. He couldn't abide by speculation, but insider trading and cheating was a language he could understand. He sipped at his sherry again. He still hadn't offered any to Jack Leighton. "So, you have some inside information, do you?" "What would you say if I told you I could set the value of the East India Shipping Company?" "I would say you're a liar and a cheat." "And you would be wrong about one of those statements." He smiled sardonically. "I am currently in control of the value of the company." "If you had such control, you would never need my help." "I wish that were true. What I am planning on doing is lowering the value of the company until we are able to purchase 51% of the entire company." "The king himself could not afford such an acquisition." "So then, if I were to tell you I could artificially lower the price of it until it was affordable to the two of us, you would be interested?" "How could you do such a thing?" Williams wasn't that gullible. "Like I said, I currently control the value of the company. There are a number of persons involved with the company who currently are most obliged to me." "What you say cannot be done, and I would be a fool to believe you. Now you've wasted enough of my time. Good day." £2,600,000. "What did you say?" "I said £2,600,000. That will be the value of the East India Shipping Company by close of business next Monday." "The current value is £6,800,000, give or take." "And why would you do this?" "To prove to you I have control over the company." "And then what?" "In another week, we're going to reduce the value of the company to £1,000,000, leaving us with the need to raise a little over £500,000 if we wish to hold the majority shares over the company." For the first time since he'd spoken to this new money man, Sir William started to see him with respect. "It's still an absurd amount of money. I don't think I could raise it, not in that time frame anyway." "And I know I can't, not on my own, but together we should be able to." "I still don't believe you hold so much power in your hands. And I wouldn't expect you to take me at my word. All I ask is that you judge me by my action." And with those words, Sir Robert Williams' greedy desire had been hooked. The next day, Jack ordered his lawyer to start indiscriminately selling his shares at a much lower price. It took some time to get going, but by close of Monday, the value of the East India Shipping Company was less than the agreed-upon $2.6 million. Chapter 105. Sir Robert Williams opened up the newspaper on Tuesday morning, and his jaw dropped when he saw the value of the East India Company. He finished the last of his English breakfast, drank his tea just a little bit too quickly so he felt it mildly burn his throat, reached for his coat and top hat, before leaving to find a criminal who he could do business with. This time, Sir Robert went to the criminal's house. The butler opened the door, and he was told Mr. Layton was sitting in the library and was expecting him. A glass of 30-year-old cognac had already been poured for him and rested on the table in front of him. He didn't wait to be offered a seat. "Very well. Say I go through with this plan." "Yes, I certainly hope you will," Jack acknowledged. "What's to stop you selling your shares first and sending the market into a spiral before I have the chance to sell any of mine?" He wrote some details on a piece of paper in front of him. "If you tried to sell off your quarter of the company's holdings, the value would crash, and you, by God, could lead me to ruin. I would never be so careless." "No, of course not. I could never work in partnership with a man so irresponsible. What I suggest is completely different." "Go on, then." "My lawyers have drawn up a covenant." He handed him several pieces of paper. "If you read through this, you will see that—" "Wait a minute. You've already drawn up a contract between you and me? Isn't that a little presumptuous?" "It may be. But as I have said before, I am currently in control of the value of a company for only a short period of time. I need to raise immense funds, and you are my most likely choice. If after reading the contract you are not interested, then I must progress down to my next choice." "Who is your next choice?" "That is none of your business. Now, I will let you read this in greater detail shortly, but basically what I suggest is we enter into a covenant in which we both agree to match purchase or sale of each share of the East India Company on a 1-to-1 basis. That way, you will be certain to buy in at its cheapest price, which I shall cause it to reach. And should the requirement be there, we do sell. We shall do so together, so neither of us becomes burdened with the entire stock at a lower price. Now, the current price of each East India Shipping Company's share is a little over £8. The agreement stands if I can lower the price to £1 each. Our agreement will come into effect. You and I shall both aim at purchasing nearly 1,000,000 shares together. This will provide us with a majority hold over the company. Once the doomsayers stop their panic about why the share prices have just been reduced to just 25% of their original value, the share value will naturally return to normality. Then we can offer to sell the entire company back to the British government, who I know are keen to purchase it." "By God, you are crazy. You want to sell the world's largest shipping company." He shook his head. "The British Navy would never agree to it." "What would you say if I told you they already had? They want it, and they're willing to pay for it." "How much?" "They've agreed on £25 million. Sir Williams shook his head. "You might just be the first person who has come from new money I think I like." That afternoon, Sir Williams left his house and went looking for money. Most banks were eager to lend him money, and he could use each as collateral for the other. By the end of the day, he'd found his £500,000 in liquid cash. He did the math that night and realized he wouldn't be able to afford the interest for very long. But by this time next month, he and Jack would control the world's largest shipping company, and then it wouldn't matter. "Teddy, I want you to send up our best bottle of cognac." "Very good, sir." He was going to be richer than he'd ever imagined. And more importantly so, he was going to be powerful. The British Empire wanted what he would own. His life had fallen into a perfect order. The value of the shares had fallen to the agreed-upon £2, and his acquisition had started. He sipped a glass of his most expensive scotch. He called for cognac. There was the sound of 3 loud knocks on the solid oak door, which could be heard from his sitting room. A messenger came in without waiting for his reply and handed him a note. He quickly read it. "Are you certain it's him?" Yes, sir. There's no mistaking it. He put on his overcoat and hat before opening the drawer in the main hallway and retrieving a pistol from inside before walking out the door. Chapter 106. Robert looked at the man who met him at the Hyde Park. He was a handsome man, and Robert felt pleased as he realized it could have been him 5 years ago. The similarities were all there. David was the first to speak. "Master, I am so sorry I failed you. I lost the diamond, and the cause was ruined. I admit the fault was entirely my own. I have searched for you, and now I finally have something to redeem myself with." Could it be he really doesn't realize it was me who tried to have him killed? "Tell me what you have for me." "I failed you. I understand I was to be executed, but—" He paused as he considered his place. "Through some fortunate mix-up, my name was exchanged with another prisoner, and I was sentenced to exile in the penal colony of New South Wales. During that time, I found the jeweler, and my wife had become romantically entangled. I had only married her for the benefit of the society, and I never loved her, beautiful though she was. But it hurt me to see her with another man. Now, after all this time, I have found out where the diamond is." "You mean the diamond is still around?" Robert had suddenly become interested in the man's story again. "Yes, the jeweler, unable to escape with it, hid it somewhere in London. You see, they have come back to retrieve it, and I am afraid Anna has vowed to come back and murder you." "The diamond's here in London!" His heart raced in anticipation. He had accepted the loss of the diamond years ago. "And the wench, the beautiful evil wench who was your wife, she's here and she wants to murder me?" His heart raced faster, but for not such a pleasant reason. "So the witch returns for me, does she? I most humbly beg your forgiveness, master, and request to be reordained into the Order of the Truth as your most humble servant." The man was obsequious. "Do you know where the diamond is?" "No, master, but I know he has returned for it. He must know." "But how do we make him release its whereabouts?" He thought about it for a moment. "If I send men to arrest him, surely he will just refuse to tell. Then we could kill him, but we will be no closer to finding the diamond, and the British Revolution will be no closer to taking place. He loves Anna. They are going around claiming to be a married couple now." He said the words vehemently, although loss could still be heard in the man's voice. Robert could understand why. She was still the most beautiful creature he had ever seen in his entire life. "Yes, but how are we going to extract the location of the diamond from the jeweler?" "He might not tell you a thing if he thought he was going to die, but maybe he would if he thought you were going to kill his Anna." "Of course." And in one simple move, he considered, he would be rid of the beautiful witch who haunted his dreams, and finally own the most brilliant diamond the world had ever discovered. "Molac, you may return to the Order of the Truth in 1 week, on the evening of next Tuesday. You must bring the girl as a sacrifice to bring out the jeweler. Do this, and you will become my brother again." Robert had been certain to use his Order of the Truth's name. "Thank you, master." "Now go." The meeting was over. Robert walked home. He picked up a newspaper on the way. The front page displayed a picture of the current share value of the East India Shipping Company. The graph showed it was in a steep incline. He had already made 4 times his money back. Sometimes a man gets to have everything he desires. Chapter 107. It was the early morning, and Jack was beating the keys of his pianoforte when she greeted him walking down the stairs. It was a Steinway grand piano, made out of mahogany with 88 ivory keys. His stepfather had insisted he learn to play as a child, as part of his overall education. He learned to write well enough, and he could do basic arithmetic. But the pianoforte was the only thing he'd really enjoyed learning. It had been just over a week since he'd discovered Matthew was still alive, and Anna had met up with him. She still hadn't told him yet, and there had been ample time to do so. He was playing a soft piece that had intermittent runs of staccatos, which portrayed his current sentiments. He had hoped she would come to his bed in the night, but instead she remained in her own room. He considered going to her room, but decided he would not push her. The last thing he wanted was to become desperate for her. "Have you discovered anything new recently?" He could have been talking about her boys, but he hoped she would tell him about Matthew. "No," she said the word just slightly faster than she ordinarily would, but otherwise he decided she appeared completely comfortable lying to him. "Nothing yet. I've made a few more inquiries with various people, but nothing has come up." She'd looked nervous, but didn't say anything else on the topic. In the end, Jack became very frustrated and got into an argument with her and walked off. "If you don't want to tell me, that's fine, but you could at least be honest with me." She came up and kissed him on the side of his cheek. "I'm sorry, but I must go. I love you." Chapter 108. Anna was nervous Matthew was going to leave before she could get to him. She had received a letter from him last night. In a simple code he had showed her when he first started to court her. It didn't take long to decipher the simple code and read it. The message had told her he had new information and needed to meet up with her at 10 o'clock the following morning, sharp. He then said he would wait at the place where they first shared a real kiss. Do you remember the place? Of course she did. It was a statue in the garden on the outer reach of London City, under the shade of a willow tree, where the lavender swamped the landscape and daisies ran wild. There was a secluded pond, and afterward, when their first kiss turned into their second, third, and multiple kisses, they both had lost all sense of propriety in the pleasure of the moment. It had been the hottest day she had ever experienced in any summer, and she decided she would swim in the lake. She undid her hair and let it all out. Then she slipped out of her sandals. She smiled at the boy who had won her heart, and with the bravery of her youth she had slipped her long flowery dress over her head. Neither of them spoke as she stood before him, with only her cotton underwear and corset to hide behind. She watched the perfect teeth of his smile and heard his awkward laugh as his eyes devoured her young body. She then entered the water and beckoned him to follow her. He was quick to undress and appeared much less nervous. They played in the water for a little while. Then, as they were getting out of the water, he held her hand in his and pulled her toward him. He laid her down on the firm grass by the bank and kissed her passionately. His hands slid up both arms until her hands were above her head. Lying on her back, almost naked, with the warm sun teasing her skin, she wished the experience could go on forever. In the end, he had tried to stop it from happening, but she had lost all desire to behave in the way her mother had raised her. Instead, she pulled him closer to her and whispered in his ear exactly what she wanted. She still remembered the way he gasped with horror at her openly wanton desires. They were married by the end of that month, and Johnny was born no more than 9 months later. Yes, I remember that place very well, she thought, with the guilt she knew she didn't deserve. Today, as she raced down the road, she wished she'd woken earlier and left the house before Jack had risen. She felt guilty she had not spoken to him and told him everything. But there wasn't time, and the last thing she wanted was a confrontation with the man she loved just before she went to do what she had to do. She didn't even understand why she was feeling so guilty. After all, it wasn't her fault she discovered her husband was still alive. It had brought back memories of a much simpler and content period in her life, and a strong love that had been broken. All in all, she hadn't completely forgiven the man for what he had done. Not that it really mattered. He was now remarried with a child. So why do I find it so difficult to tell him Matthew is still alive? Do I still love him? She knew the answer to the question, and it surprised her. When she first discovered Matthew's infidelity, she should have felt hurt. She was certainly shocked and disappointed in the state of humanity. But if she examined her feelings honestly, she had been relieved when Matthew told her he had met someone else and now had a child. Her first thought had been, "Please, don't take Jack away from me." She hurried along the cobblestones, not paying much attention to the man who followed her far in the distance. When she arrived, she was relieved to see Matthew had not left yet. "I was worried you were going to leave before I got here." "It was close, but I had to wait for you. I needed to see you again. I'm so glad you came. Really, I am, Anna." Matthew came up close to her, and then embraced her, not as lovers do, but as people who once loved each other very much. "There is something I have to tell you, Anna." In the distance, 2 men could be seen idly watching the happenings in the park. "Sir Williams knows you're here in London." She took a step back, clearly made uncomfortable by the news. "But we've been so careful. Do you know how he knows?" "No, my friends tell me he is planning a trap. So far your ruse has worked, and although he knows you and Jack are back in London, he has no idea you are living next door to him. I don't believe he would ever imagine the heights you have risen to in society." "But how did you find out?" "Because I went to him." "You did what?" "I needed to see him again. You said he's my brother. I had to know if it was true." She looked at his face as he spoke the last sentence and then stopped. His countenance provided her with the answer she already knew to be true. So, Robert is definitely Matthew's older brother. "Was that the only reason you went to him?" "No, there was more to it than that. Seeing you reminded me of my real obligation in coming back to London. I have to find John and Joseph." Anna felt herself respond to his words, and also felt instantly relieved. "I'm sorry. I thought for an instant you'd betrayed me. After you told me of your efforts to find our boys, I realized how few options there were available. The most likely, of course, is they've died. But I cannot accept that. And the more I thought about it, the more I decided if they had died, there would be some record. A priest who had spoken at their funeral, or something. But there is no record. Do you know where they are?" The words were spoken fast and desperately. "No, but I have an idea how we're going to find them." "Speak then, why do you keep pausing?" "If Robert is my brother, of which, having seen him again, there can be no doubt, and he is the only person who knew about our boys, then he must know what happened to them. You said yourself there was no trace of them in the secret den at our old place. So They must have been retrieved by Robert. Therefore, if we're ever going to discover the truth, then we're going to need Robert to talk.
But how do we do that?
I have asked him to forgive me for my failure as a brother of the Order of the Truth, and he has welcomed me back on the one condition that I can fulfill.
And what is that?
I gave him you. Chapter 109. 20 minutes later, David watched as she walked away. He was pleased she'd consented so readily. A wicked part of him was still amazed her motherly instincts were so powerful she was readily capable of forgiving his previous deceit and of assuming his intentions honorable. The ball of deceit had started to build up momentum. She will do nicely, Molek. It was an older man, with the dark robe of a priest covering all but his face. Yes, after all these years, this was the purpose for which I had been sent to marry her in the first place. Her time has come to ignite the British Revolution. The blood of the beautiful woman who has raised far above her true place in society is what we need to start the British Revolution. Like the mold on the last of the bread in France, so too will this ignite our revolution, the way the French one did. Yes, and she is much more beautiful than I expected. She is perfect. She had to be. Anything less would not work for our cause. Yes, but how you can sacrifice her, I do not know. The cause we have always lived for is more important than the wanton lust for a remarkably beautiful woman. Spoken truly, Molek. You have grown much since you were first introduced to us all those years ago, since I first ordained you in the Order of the Truth. Matthew looked at the man. So, you're really the Grandmaster? Chapter 110. Thomas entered the Goldman's Club. It was only 8 p.m. on Wednesday evening, probably a little early for the night's games. Jack and he had settled into a midweek routine of meeting there for a night, indulging in the vices of a gentleman, drinking, gambling, and occasionally womanizing. He had recently lost his virginity here. It had been a gift from one of the barmaids on his birthday. It was so amazing he had instantly fancied himself in love with the girl, much to the discontent of Jack Layton. He whistled to himself as he approached the building. It was a habit he'd picked up from Jack. Thomas was one of the elite few who would ever be welcome at such an expensive establishment. A heavy-set man in a suit came toward him as he advanced toward the premises. "I'm afraid I can't let you in tonight, young Mr. Williams." It was Tony, the security guard, who looked wider than he was tall. A lot of it was probably fat, he guessed, but then there must have been a hell of a lot of muscle under it to move it. Either way, he wasn't getting past. "Tony, I've been here more than a dozen times over the past few months, and I've always been admitted entrance." "Things change," was all he said, as he shrugged his shoulders. Whatever it was, Tony wasn't going to be forthcoming with it. "What things are you talking about?" He fidgeted with the timepiece attached to his right breast pocket, as though he had been waiting for someone to arrive. "My money must still be good here?" Tony shrugged his shoulders again, a gesture that could only mean Thomas really didn't matter to him. It was rare for someone not to notice him, particularly after they discovered who his father was. "Oh, come on, Tony, please, it's me. At least let me in on what's happened since I was here last." He tried to hide his childish use of the word please. "Intimations have been made that you are not a man of your word and are unable to pay your own debts." But that's absurd. I've always paid for my debts. Mr. Layton has always paid for your debts. That's true. The veracity in the statement stung at his pride. I have a private agreement with Mr. Layton, and I always pay my debts. So I will thank you if you will let me pass and in the future keep to your own business. It took effort, but he mustered up his most pompous voice, which he'd learned from a lifetime of watching his father interact with any person who wasn't the King of England. Before he finished his sentence, he started walking around the rude man. He didn't get far at all before Tony's vice-like hands gripped his shoulders. He wasn't going to be able to get around him. I'll advise you not to lay your hands on a gentleman again, if you know what's good for you. I don't care for you or your pompous attitude, young Thomas, but you'll not be welcome here again, and if you don't leave, I'll have you arrested and charged with unlawful trespass. Mr. Layton will back me up? I doubt that very much. There was something about the way he started to chuckle that made Thomas fear the absolute worst had happened. The lady of the house came out. Tony, what is all this trouble? This little scoundrel is trying to return to the club. Who is it? Young Thomas Williams. Ah, the one that can't pay his debts. That's the one. Mr. Williams, you're no longer welcome here. Please leave, or I'll make sure you spend the night in the prison cells. And that's only because I have a soft spot for young gentlemen. But if you act like a scoundrel, I'll treat you like one. But this is insane. I've always paid my debts. He was feeling angrier than hurt by now. Yes, well, I think Mr. Layton would have a thing or two to say about that. But Mr. Layton is my friend. He will fix this mistake, and then you'll both be sorry. I doubt that. Ah, here comes Mr. Layton now. I'm certain he'll clear things up for me. Chapter 111. Jack was still reeling over the new information that his wife's first husband was still alive. Where did this place him? Was he even legitimately married? His wife had never been divorced, having believed at the time her husband was dead. What would she do now? The most frustrating question of all, why didn't she tell him of it? Then, to see them both in their lover's embrace, he no longer felt the need to wait for her justification. He no longer cared for her opinion. He was a man of pride, and he would not let her banter his honor about so cheaply. He had almost forgotten about the revenge he'd planned for young Mr. Williams. Tonight he had approached the Goldman Club for the first time, for the same reason that almost every other gentleman came to it, to drink away his loss. It was poor luck on young Thomas's part they should meet on a night like tonight. He had every intention of bringing young Mr. Williams to unequivocal ruin, but in the state he was in tonight, such a very dangerous temperament could go too far on the poor child. On this evening, Thomas was the last thought on his mind. And then Jack heard his voice. Jack! Oh, Jack, thank goodness you're here tonight! Even from that distance, he could see the fear in the poor child's voice. Thomas, what are you doing here? His voice was abrupt, but not confrontational. It's Wednesday night. We always meet here on Wednesday nights. Have you got the £120 you owe me? He hadn't raised his voice yet, and he spoke the words friendly enough. Well, about that, as I've been saying, I just have to wait until the end of the month to receive my allotment, and then I will repay you, plus the interest I owe you. A gentleman never counts on the generosity of others. Yes, of course, Thomas tried to explain. You fail to act like a gentleman, and for that I have had to take matters into my own hands. I have spoken to the owner of the Goldman Club, and have instructed her not to allow you admittance. and I have sent the bailiff to your father's estate with an order to repossess your property to the value of the said amount you owe."
"But, Mr. Layton—"
He tried to explain once more, but was fumbling his words like a child brought before the headmaster for punishment. "All I can say, young Mr. Williams, is I am most disappointed in you." Jack noticed his formal use of the name Mr. Williams, and his disappointment seemed to strike harder on poor Thomas than anything else. Thomas went to speak, but the words couldn't come out. His eyes welled up with tears, and like a child unable to confront the position he had made for himself, he turned and ran away. It appeared to be the attack on his honor as a gentleman that broke him. Jack ignored him as he left, and went in to have a drink with an old man in a brown robe. Chapter 112. She heard Jack come in late that night. The hands of the grandfather clock could only just be read in the limited light. It looked like 3 a.m. to her. She hadn't fallen asleep yet anyway. She knew what was coming tomorrow, and had longed to be held by him, and hoped if she stayed awake, he would come to her. He sounded quite drunk. It was unlike him to return home overcome by the effects of strong liquor. He had never felt the need to continue consuming alcohol beyond his control, and when he did, it was rare. He struggled to maintain control, no matter how much he consumed. Tonight was different. Something had upset him, she gathered. She listened carefully. Downstairs there was the sound of a broken vase as he stumbled on his way toward the stairs. "Shit. Is everything very well, Jack?" She came for him. "Yes. No. It's all shit, isn't it?" "Whatever is the matter with you?" "It's over." At first, she wondered if he meant their relationship. A moment of panic rushed her before he spoke the next words. "Sir Williams has followed us into financial ruin, and his only boy, Thomas, looks like he is about to bring harm to himself over my betrayal. He was a good boy and didn't deserve what we did to him, young and stupid though he was." "I'm sorry." She understood why he was so drunk now. "All in the name of love, my dear, for whatever that was worth." This she didn't understand, but she could understand why he had regretted hurting the boy. Maybe, she considered, it would have been better to take her pain out on Sir Williams alone. She went to hold him, and he withdrew from her loving arms. "But do you still love me?" "Of course I do. You know I do." She was insulted. But worst of all, she feared he knew what she was going to do tomorrow. If she told him, he would never let her go through with it. She was certain he would not let her risk her life. "Then why don't you tell me the truth?" "What truth? Lies, woman. You are telling me lies. Don't you think I can tell after all we've been through when you're lying to me? After all I have done for you, how can you not at the very least be honest with me?" She wanted so badly to tell him the truth, to tell him she was going to help Matthew so he could find her sons, but he would never let it happen. "I can't. I'm sorry. If you can just give me one more day, I promise I'll tell you everything." "Do you know something?" "What, Jack, what?" Ruining Sir William's life was justified. But we did a great wrongness by ruining young Thomas's life. And you know what I hate the most? Please, please don't. I hate the fact that I would honestly do it all over again, because I love you." With that, he slumped forward and fell asleep. She sat there through the night, nursing his head on her lap. She wished she could take the pain away from him, and promised herself she would make it all very well tomorrow, after the necessary deed was done. If she lived, she even told herself she would go and retrieve the poor boy who Jack had hurt so badly because of her wrongdoings. But first, she had to get through a gathering of the men of the Order of the Truth. Chapter 113. The next day, one of the servants helped her put Jack into his bed. Daniel, one of Jack's many footmen, promised to force him to drink plenty of water throughout the day, and to reassure him she would return late this evening with answers to everything. It was the mid-afternoon before she left. Jack was still sound asleep, and with her duty complete, she kissed him for what she dearly hoped would not be the last time. And then she went out to meet David and prepare for her role in this evil performance. She walked down Piccadilly Lane, taking a shortcut through Hyde Park and then following the maze of small paths to the River Thames. Out in front of the Royal Arms Inn, he waited for her. The Royal Arms Inn was where he'd been staying. It was far less regal than the name suggested. A place for traveling tradesmen and the laboring class, nothing more. It was private, and she could prepare herself in anonymity to the delicate fashion that Matthew had explained to her would be required. He kissed her on her forehead, as he would a child rather than his former wife. She barely felt his soft lips touch her skin. "Thank you for coming, Anna." "I'm doing this for Michael, not for you, so don't thank me." She looked at him seriously for a second. "Just make sure I get out of this thing alive." "I'll do my best, I promise." An empty copper bath sat out of place in the middle of his rented room. He immediately started the slow process of heating up the metal buckets and filling the bath with warm water. "You have to be perfectly clean for them to accept the sacrifice." "I understand." She felt strange, undressing before him, but there wasn't time to make him leave while she cleaned herself. There was ample soap in the bath, and as she scrubbed, she felt better to see the bubbles that concealed most of her body. David went on with his process of preparing her dress. It was white, and he had explained to her it was symbolic of her giving herself to the Order of the Truth. Specifically, it was his gift to the society, so he would be ordained. "Once your body has been sacrificed to the will of the society, I will be taken in. Once I am a brother of the Order of the Truth, Robert will tell me all we need to know, and we will find our boys, I promise. Do you understand what is required of you?" She nodded her head in agreement ever so slightly. "Do you understand me?" He seemed angry with her. "After all that I'm risking, how dare he be angry with me?" "Yes, I understand. Because if we do not perform the ceremony properly, we will both be killed tonight. Do you understand?" "Yes, of course I understand." She shaved her legs and the fine hair underneath her arms, and lastly she shaved the mound between her legs, until she had no more hair on her body than a child. "Now the hair on your head needs to be washed. It needs to be perfect. You will have to help me." Matthew had done it enough times when they were married. He knew what to do. He filled the metal bucket up with clean water and then heated it mildly on the fire. Then he poured it gently over her hair until she felt the warm water flow over her hair and face. She shut her eyes. It was the first time she realized just how vulnerable she was. She was naked in a bath with a man who had married her and deceived her many years ago. She felt the rate of her pulse increase and fought to control the urge to breathe rapidly. She felt him pour some soap on her hair and massage it into her scalp. It felt nice, and she found herself instantly thinking about all the times she had done this with Jack, and to her shame, she felt herself become immediately aroused by the prospect. She was ashamed she should even consider such thoughts, considering what she was about to do. Another bucket of warm water could be felt as it was poured over her hair and face. She opened her eyes and thought she noticed him staring at the gap in the bubbles that had formed along her breasts, down to a small gap in her legs, as the clean water washed them away. Anna turned on her side abruptly, feeling every bit as vulnerable as her position had made her. Neither person spoke for a time. "Here, dry yourself, Anna." He walked out of the room, as though he had acknowledged her discomfort. She quickly got out of the bath and dried herself with the clean towel he had given her. She asked about the undergarments she'd be wearing, but he told her for the ceremony she was not to wear them. David had explained the entire process to her before she had agreed to it. But even so, as he reminded her of each step, she felt more and more ashamed. He told her this was good, because it was her insecurity and vulnerability that were being symbolically sacrificed for the ceremony. "I'm ready," she said, now that she was dry. "Good." He came up behind her and handed her a handmade, perfectly white, regal dress. In this time, all dresses were handmade, no? She dressed and felt somewhat better. "What about my hair?" "It must hang completely unaided behind on your shoulders." "Like this?" she asked, brushing it backwards in long strokes. He nodded in agreement. "How do I look now?" She watched as David examined her the way he did on their wedding day. "You look perfect." Chapter 114. She did not have to wait long for the sun to set. "It's time." He looked out the window at the setting sun. "We must leave." "All right." She nodded her head. As her hand reached for the door, David placed his hand firmly on it, stopping her from opening it. He then reached for her and kissed her on her lips. "What the hell was that for?" She slapped at his face. He held her still with both of his arms, made strong by nearly a decade of hard labor in the new penal colony. "Are you ready to go through with this? Because there is still time to leave it. If we fuck it up, we're both dead." "Yes, I'm ready." "Good." He reached down and again kissed her on her lips. It felt nicer than she remembered, and her entire body was warmed by the experience. But yet again, she then slapped his face as hard as she could. "Don't you ever do that again!" Chapter 115. Jack rolled over and stared at the blurring sky through the window. His head hurt like he'd been in a bad fight in which he had come out second best. Memories of the previous night came flooding back to him, with the emotional pain worse than the alcohol-induced pain. He swept his left arm backwards as he tentatively felt for her. "Where is she?" "She's gone, and she didn't say where she was going." It was Daniel, one of his many footmen, who had patiently been waiting at the end of his bedroom for him to wake. "But she did tell me that I'm to force you to consume copious amounts of water to wash whatever poisons you felt the need to consume last night out of your system. And she promised to tell everything you want to know if you will just wait for her to return tonight." "Oh, God, it's going to happen tonight, isn't it?" "Shit. What time is it?" "It's 5 p.m., sir." He had never meant to sleep so long. "Daniel, I want you to go quick to the armory and bring me the chest labeled Death or Honor." "Your dueling pistols, sir?" the man confirmed in his British, monotone drawl. "Yes. Now go." "Does it really have to come to this?" The man looked quite concerned, although his monotone voice had not changed a bit. "I don't mean to pry in the business that is none of mine, but if it is of any use to you, may I just say that Mrs. Layton seemed most apologetic and adamant if you just wait until her return, all would be explained to your satisfaction. My quarrel isn't with Mrs. Layton. I'm trying to protect her. Now go." Jack immediately got out of bed. His head was sore, and the world seemed to keep spinning unnaturally after he sat up. He knew exactly what had to be done. Chapter 116. With courage she did not feel, Anna looked around the room in which she was now placed at the center. She sat with her legs bent, so she was kneeling in supplication, her white dress covering all the skin on her legs. The room was much larger than she had expected. The walls formed a perfect circle, large enough for nearly 100 men. With stone floors and walls, she noted the only way in or out was the way in which she had come in. And that way, at last, had been blocked by a thick wooden door that now had an iron bolt through it to ensure it did not move. David had never said anything about the room being locked. Anna wished she'd been able to determine where she was in London. That was, if she was in London at all. The coach which had picked her and David up outside the Royal Arms Inn had curtains on its windows which prevented her from seeing out. Then she had been driven for what seemed like hours. At one point she could have sworn she heard the sound of fast-flowing water as they crossed a weir. She searched her memory for any weirs that crossed fast-flowing rivers in London. There were none she could recall. It added to her heightened sense of vulnerability, which then led to fear. She regretted her obstinacy and wished she'd at least had the good sense to tell Jack where she was going. Of course, he would have talked her out of it, or worse yet, simply stopped her from leaving the house tonight. A sentiment so deep it was barely out of reach told her David would not betray her tonight. She struggled with the knowledge he had deceived her before. She watched as 100 or more candles that were positioned around the room were carefully lit in succession. The light allowed her to see better at first, but once they reached their full glow, they impaired her vision outside the inner circle, where men in black robes were starting to congregate. What she saw did little to reduce her apprehension. Opposite her, in the same position, sat Matthew. Unlike her, he was dressed in an entirely black robe, with just his face showing. There were somewhere in the vicinity of 100 men, all similarly robed. As each candle was lit, the light in the room made it more difficult for her to make out the face of each man who stood behind the candlelight. Without warning, a man's voice could be heard. "What is your name?" the question was asked, from a voice that sounded as cold as the stone floor. "Molech." It was David's voice that responded, in a simple, confident tone. She could no longer see him, but she recognized his voice. "What do you desire?" "To serve the truth." "And what is the truth?" "That we are all as good as the service we can provide our fellow man. Our race, religion, and birthing make no difference to our ability to serve the Almighty God." "What is your name?" It was a different voice this time, louder and more resonating. "Molech." "Who do you serve?" "I serve the truth." "And what is the truth?" "We are all evil." There was a gasp, as though he had made the wrong response. "Kill him! Kill him now!" There was a shout in unison. "Kill the girl! They must both die! It is the only way!" "What is the truth?" It was the first time she could discern from which robed man came the question. He wore the same black robe as the others, but had a blue star on his hood. The Grandmaster, my enemy, Sir Robert Williams. "All men are equally evil. We serve the truth by slaying those who do not succeed in controlling it. So, we are all condemned to die?" Again, the Grandmaster was speaking. "Yes. And then, how do you reconcile that the words remain in existence?" "God ordained. no one should live forever. Are you evil? Yes. Do you deserve to die? Yes. Only silence. The Brotherhood will decide your fate tonight. Tell us. It was an older voice, not long for the world, but kindly enough. You failed us, and were banished to death. Through events not of your own doing, you have survived in exile. Why have you now returned to us, Molech? To complete the prophecy. And what is the prophecy? That a woman so beautiful and rich would one day be cleansed, so the British Revolution could begin. And how have you cleansed her? Let us see her. Yes, let us see how cleansed she is. Strip her now! Anna was frantic with fear. David was not in control of the ceremony, but to do anything contrary to what the Brotherhood wanted would be suicide for them both. David pulled at her clothes, tearing the back of her white dress from her shoulders. She screamed suddenly, before she could get control of herself, as her right breast fell free of her dress. Silence her! A man from somewhere behind her came and tied something around her mouth to stop her from screaming. Inside, she screamed like a child. The rest of the clothes were then stripped. Good. Yes, she is perfect. Yes, perfect. She must be sacrificed. Yes, of course. Yes, but of course she must. But how must she be sacrificed? Yes, how? Molech, tell us, how is she to be sacrificed? We must slaughter her, so her blood is purged for the sins of the unworthy noble class. Anna looked at the heavily bolted door that barred her escape. How could I be so stupid to trust him, after all he's done to me? The acceptance of her inevitable death was calming to her in its certainty. Chapter 117. A man came behind her and roughly held her arms behind her head, locking them into a wooden cradle. The man was completely robed, but the arm he used to restrain her seemed somehow familiar to her. Each of her legs was then pulled back and placed in a block. Naked, she made the perfect star of purity. Kill her now! Kill her now! But how, Molech? Purge her of her noble blood! She squirmed in her restraints, a feeble attempt for any living creature to survive. She watched as David approached her. The true wickedness could be seen displayed in his eyes, a large dagger in his right hand. Kill her now! David stared at her as though he was in a trance. She couldn't believe, after everything, he could kill her without so much as a hint of remorse. He brought the dagger up behind his head. Kill her now, the crowd said in unison. This is how I die? It was a question. After all that she could see, she didn't believe it. She then felt her right hand grip the handle of something. When you get the chance, shoot the man with the blue mark on his robe. The voice was so soft, she barely heard it at all, yet somehow it was so familiar. David brought his arms down with the force of his entire body weight behind it. The sound of blade slicing through tough hide in one quick motion could be heard echoing throughout the room. So, it is now over. The wound doesn't even hurt anymore. She watched as though she were in a dream, as he deliberately turned and sliced the neck of the man standing beside him. He was so quick, the other robed men didn't even realize what had happened. Anna then felt the pressure on her wrist weaken. David had sliced the leather which had bound her wrists. She then slid her arm through the wooden restraint and picked up the pistol. Her legs, still bound, kept her on the floor. The man with the blue hood came at her and quickly cut her legs free before picking her up to run. She held the pistol as steady as she could and shot him in the stomach. The man dropped her as he cried out in pain. She ran to the corner where the door was still heavily bolted. A tall man in a dark robe shot 2 more persons before pulling out a sword. It wasn't an ornamental saber like the ones the officers in the cavalry wore. It was long and heavy-looking, like a broadsword from medieval times. It was a weapon that wielded blood wherever it went. A man in a robe came beside her and quickly unbolted the door. She looked at the mayhem and blood that had been shed before quickly leaving. He was the only person who survived the bloodshed within the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood of the Truth did not allow weapons, other than the ornamental ones used in sacrificial ceremonies, to be brought into the inner circle. This meant the strong, tall man was allowed to slaughter the remaining robed men unchallenged. Some tried to run, others kneeled in supplication, while others simply prayed for their salvation. All were slaughtered. David took out a number of men by himself. In the end, there were only 2 other persons left standing in the room, David and the robed man with the evil sword, now dripping in blood. The man pulled back his hood. It was Jack. "Jack! My God, how did you find me?" He picked her up and kissed her on her lips. "It was David's uncle who found me, and told me about what was going to happen here tonight." "My uncle?" It was David's turn to be surprised. "Yes, your uncle was the Grandmaster." She searched the room but could not find the man that he spoke about. "But where is Sir Williams?" "That's his blue star robe over there." David went over and pulled back the robe. It wasn't Sir Williams at all. "That's your uncle, David. I think he's dead." David kneeled down to embrace the old man, who had not looked as though he was going to be long for the world before the events of tonight drastically shortened his time on earth. To his surprise, the old man spoke. "I'm sorry. I have failed you." "No, I'm sorry I have failed you." With the last of his strength, David's uncle explained how he must travel to the family Chateau de Fortress in Gascogne. The uncle told Matthew before he died that he had a will and testament for his entire estate and title of Count de Gascogne to his nearest living relative, who until this moment would have been Robert, but now would be David, because he was the last person with full William's blood in his veins. Chapter 118. It had been a trap. Robert couldn't believe it. He was glad he had swapped his robe with his uncle. He would have been killed otherwise. He had abandoned his brothers in their time of need. Any that survived would most certainly be after him. His life would be very short indeed if he didn't escape London immediately. He ran through the fields to the south as fast as his legs would carry him. For the first time, he regretted the extra weight he carried on his hips. It had been a long time since he'd been in a position in which he had to run. But fear of what was surely following him was a strong incentive. After he could no longer run any more, he stopped at a stream and drank until his stomach hurt. He checked his timepiece. 5:31. The sun would be coming up soon. In the distance, he could see the smoke rising from a homestead. The farmer would already be up, but he was getting desperate and needed a horse. He walked toward the homestead. As he approached, he noticed a horse was already saddled. Its owner, presumably, had just gone inside to get something. Fear and desperation had made him brazen. He took his opportunity and approached the horse. Gently placing his hand on the side of the horse, he heard it make a gentle neigh and nudged his chest with its nose. "Hey there," Robert said, as he soothingly rubbed the horse's mane. It was a large horse. Had he been thinking more coherently, He would have wondered why such a beautiful creature would be living in the north as a farmer's property. The beast in front of him was a war horse, its muscles enormous. A gentleman would have paid a fortune for the beast. It was not the horse owned by a serf. But he was not thinking clearly. He untied the tether of the horse's rein and whispered, "I'll look after you if you look after me." He placed his left foot in the stirrup and used his right arm on the saddle to mount the beautiful creature in a fluent motion that demonstrated his experience. He didn't wait to see whether he was going to get caught and kicked the horse into a canter. Behind him, he heard someone shout, "Halt!" He slapped the horse's rump and tried to kick it into a full gallop. At 500 paces, he could see the path into the forest. He was almost there. Once in the forest on this beast, he could outrun anyone in pursuit. In the distance, a single rifle shot could be heard. Chapter 119. Anna kissed Jack with all the passion of a love that overcame anything. "I was afraid you didn't love me." "After all we have been through?" She looked at him curiously. "Of course I love you, and I always will." He kissed her again on her lips. Jack wished he could hold her forever in his arms, but they were not completely safe yet. Things had to be done. Sir Williams had survived and could be still very dangerous so long as he had his wealth. He had to get back to London and bankrupt him first. Anna, he realized, could be sent to see Belinda and find out where Robert would go to hide. But would Belinda betray him? "I have 4 horses waiting for us. We must make haste if we're to beat Robert back to London." He watched as David looked at the 3 people remaining, as though he wondered who the 4th person was. "So, you knew about my grandfather, then?" "Yes. It was he who had told me about what was likely to take place tonight." "So he knew what you would do, that his fellow members would all die, and yet he did so anyway?" "Yes. He truly believed in cleansing a corrupt organization. From what he tells me, the Order of the Truth was about as evil as it could be." "Yes, but some good people died today." "Yes." All Jack could do was agree. "I wish I had known my uncle. I think he was a good man." "That I am certain of." Anna and Jack rode back to London together. David assured them they would see him back at the Sinclair house in a couple of days' time. First, he said, he wanted to make sure his uncle received a proper burial. Chapter 120. Jack's first visit once he was back in London was to his lawyer, Smith. It wasn't yet 7 a.m., so he went to Smith's house instead of his practice. It was rude, for sure, but as his only client, Jack was entitled to treat him poorly. When he knocked on the door, he felt certain his butler was going to tell him to leave, but upon seeing it was he, the butler looked less confident of his master's position over the matter. "Ah, Mr. Leighton, I should have guessed at this hour." The butler looked at the blood still on his clothes. He probably should have changed, but there wasn't time. "Is the master expecting you?" Jack could see the butler was struggling to refrain from pointing out the time of the morning. "No, but I'll see him now just the same." It clearly irked the man that he was to have a visitor at this hour. "Please, do come in. He will be down in a minute." "Good." Jack walked in and placed his sore feet up on the coffee table, as though he owned the place. As far as he was concerned, he probably did. He'd certainly spent enough on Lord Smith's services over the past 2 years. He should be afforded any and every comfort he so desired. Lord Smith walked in. "Good God, Jack, you're covered in blood! What have you done this time?" The man laughed good-naturedly. Jack was an obnoxious client, but he was certain he was by far the highest paying, and Lord Smith had learned to be patient with his idiosyncrasies. "There are limits to what I can achieve in court, you know." The last part was spoken in utter seriousness. "Relax and sit down, Lord Smith. I haven't killed anyone." He then looked at the blood that seemed to cake his tunic and looked guilty. "No one the courts will ever hear about anyway." He spoke cheerfully. His lawyer-client privilege was sacred to Lord Smith. "So then, what are you here at this terrible hour to discuss?" "I need to sell every East India Shipping Company share I own." "It will be hard to get rid of that many. Even with the inevitable price drop, you own so many shares, no one will be able to raise enough funds to purchase them very fast. It will take a few weeks. Is that very well?" "No, I need it done today." "That can't be done." "It can if you reduce the price of the shares." "You would have to reduce the price unconscionably low for them to sell." "How about £0.50?" "£0.50?" Lord Smith looked at him. "By Christ! But you're serious, aren't you?" "Yes, I need to bankrupt someone." "This was all about bankrupting Sir William's?" "Yes. Do you mind if I purchase some of them?" Lord Smith's greedy little lawyer instinct kicked in. "I don't care if you buy the bloody lot. I want them all gone today, and I want the value of the East India Shipping Company to be less than £1. "It's your money you want to throw away." His lawyer had given up trying to negotiate with him when he had these whims. He stood up to leave. A messenger came to the front door. "It appears, Mr. Leighton, you have a message," the butler intoned. He looked unimpressed. "Ah, good, you're here. This message has been dispatched urgently for you." The messenger appeared short of breath, as though he had been riding hard. Jack opened the letter. "Dear Jack Leighton, I do not know what has changed, that you now find my company utterly unsavory. I can only believe that the fault is entirely my own in the making. I have taken a commission in the army, and if I survive long enough, I will ensure I do not fall into the same folly with my funds before I repay you all that I am indebted to you. I write to you specifically today to apologize for my behavior. I leave tomorrow for war in the Temne Kingdom, and if the worst should happen, I would like you to know I valued your friendship, and I am sorry I betrayed it. I will not make contact with you again until I have the means to restore my honor. Kindly, Thomas Williams." Chapter 121. It was 3 p.m. by the time Sir Williams walked into his lawyer's office. He limped with his left leg. The pain was only minor compared with the wound to his pride. He must have been 500 paces away when the rifle fired. It had been a lucky shot, he decided. It went straight through the side of his left calf muscle, more of a scrape along the skin than a deep wound. It could have been much worse, but it didn't stop it hurting like hell. He had bigger problems to deal with than a sore leg. The biggest was the need to access all his funds so he could escape, and quick. "Quick, sell everything." "I'm afraid you don't have anything left to sell." "What do you mean I have no money? I bloody well own nearly 500,000 shares in the East India Shipping, for God's sake." "Yes, but they were doing poorly, and so—" "But look here, the newspaper says they were trading at nearly £10 a share today. I own nearly 500,000 of them." "But you sold them, sir, when they were low." "What do you mean? I did what?" His lawyer seemed aghast, as his master should not know about events of such a serious nature. "The covenant, sir. You agreed to buy or sell 1 share for every 1 share Mr. Jack Leighton exchanged. So, naturally, When Mr. Layton started to dump his 500,000 shares, you were obliged to sell them too." "So, what did I sell them for?" His heart already feared the worst. "I'm afraid you sold them for less than £0.5 each." "£0.5 each? But that's not even enough to pay off the mortgages I undertook to purchase them in the start." "Yes, sir. That is what I've been trying to tell you." "But for Mr. Layton to do that, he would have lost everything he owned too." "Yes, he must have." "Oh, dear God. That was what he wanted from the start. He wanted to ruin me, and he wanted it so bad, he was willing to ruin himself." "It would appear so." "So, I'm bankrupt then?" "Yes. You will have to sell the estate, but from what I see here, you'll be bankrupt no matter what you do." Could it be? Jack Layton was my jeweler, and he has had my diamond all along? He called upon a number of banking people, none of whom would lend him money because word had already spread he was about to go under as a result of poor speculation. All his so-called friends looked at him with disdain. No one looked sympathetic to his position, and why should they? If he had seen any of them act as recklessly as he had, Robert would have expected nothing more for them than debtor's prison, and they knew it, every one of them. With each rejection, he felt the noose of bankruptcy chafe at his throat. Sir Robert Williams may have been born into wealth, but he had always been a fighter, and his treatment of his younger brother taught him he was willing to do anything to save himself. He would survive this. He just had to escape London, and to do that, he would need gold. Chapter 122. The farmer said, "Your horse has just been stolen." Thomas felt his heart race. "What? Here? Now? I just saw some man jump on the back of him. Damn horse thief!" Thomas responded quickly. He knew exactly what he needed to do. His hand reached behind him to unstrap the Baker rifle from his shoulder, his green tunic showing the pride of the 95th Riflemen. It was an experimental regiment. He lined up the target in the distance. The thief was riding at a full gallop, but it didn't affect his shooting aim because the man was making for a gap in the trees, which meant he was riding in a straight line. He lay down on the grass and took aim. "You'll never get a shot from this distance," the farmer said. He breathed in slowly, then exhaled slowly. When he had exhaled half his lungs, he aligned the cross targets of his rifle with the man's body, careful not to hit his own horse, and then squeezed the trigger. The distinct sound of the bullet leaving the long Baker rifle's barrel could be heard. In the distance, the man's left leg seemed to jolt suddenly. Damn! I must have hit his leg instead. Wow, that's some great shooting. Yes, well, it wasn't good enough. I was aiming for his chest. But he's wounded. I saw it, I did. That leg of his is going to hurt like buggery. We'll be able to catch up with him quick smart. I'm not planning on catching up with him. The man spoke with a sense of fatality. What do you mean you're not going to go after him? That horse was a beauty. I've joined the 95th Riflemen. We're heading off this evening for Portsmouth for the Kingdom of Koya, and I'm not going to miss it by chasing after my horse. But won't you need your horse wherever you're fighting? No, I wouldn't have taken him into conflict. I planned on selling him in Portsmouth before I left. Now, I'll be lucky if I can get there in time. You should make it if you leave soon. Thanks, I will. This is the third time this month thieves have raided my farm.
I got a good look at the man who took her. I'm going to go after him. Maybe this might be my one chance to stop the buggers." "Well, good luck. Here's the paperwork for my horse. You won't be able to condemn the man if I'm not around to prove ownership. I'll tell you what. I'll never see the horse again. How about I sign her over to you? And if you catch the bastard who stole her, you can get him convicted and hung. Hopefully even get her back for your troubles." "That's very kind of you. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, young man." "Thomas. Thomas Williams." "Well, Mr. Williams, you look after yourself over in that war of yours. You will do a lot of good for Britain if your shooting is anything to go off. Thank you, and good luck catching your horse thief." Chapter 123. Thomas made his way from Woking to Portsmouth, where his regiment waited for him. He shuffled at a pace only a little slower than a run for 20 minutes, then walked for 20 minutes. He stopped for lunch at a creek in Stockton Well. It was a short break, but it refreshed him for his long journey. It had been years since he had tried to travel so far without his horse. The sun was setting as he approached the barracks at Portsmouth. He couldn't see the ship he had been assigned to. A warrant officer then approached him. The man sounded quite cheerful as he spoke. "Are you Thomas Williams?" "Yes." "You are late. The ship has already left. There's going to be hell to pay." Chapter 124. "I'm afraid I have the worst news to tell you. I really don't know how to say it, but I must. You have become such a dear friend." Anna couldn't even sit in the Williams' exquisite sitting room overlooking the meadows because she was so anxious. "What is it? Tell me now. I will not be very cross, I promise," replied Belinda. Anna took a deep breath. "It's about a repeat of Sir William's history." "What about his history?" "Oh my, this is worse than I expected. You really don't know, do you?" "No, I don't have a clue what you're talking about." "You know he was a gambler." "A gambler?" Belinda laughed. "You must be joking. Robert hates nothing more than speculation." "But you are mistaken. He has been successful until now, but recently he has made a very bad speculation. Jack tried to talk him out of it, but it appears he has mortgaged everything on it, and now it has gone bust." "How much have we lost?" "All of it." "Is there nothing that can be done?" "Jack tells me he is afraid there is nothing we can do. He just feels so responsible. After all, he should have talked Robert out of it." "I'm ruined, then. He has ruined the both of us." "That might not have to be the case, if you are willing to help us." Chapter 125. Sir Williams came through the doors to their mansion at 14 Piccadilly Lane. For the first time in her life, Belinda saw her husband as erratic and flustered. "Quick, I need anything of value." "Whatever seems to be the matter, darling?" "No time to explain. Quick, go get any jewels you have in the safe." "I can't do that, dear." "What do you mean, woman? Why not?" He appeared panicky. "Quick, give me your engagement ring. It must be worth a fortune." "No, it's mine." She felt the sudden blow to her face like fire. "I can't believe he actually struck me." "I said give it to me." He pulled at her finger, but it doesn't come off. Then he grabs a knife. "No, wait. I can get it off myself." She quickly pulled at it. "Whatever has gotten into you?" "We're ruined. Everything's gone. We need to escape before they come for us."
She watched as he ran up the stairs into his bedroom. The sound of the priceless Rembrandt being thrown out of the way could be heard as its canvas tore on the ground. From downstairs, she heard the distinct clicking sound as he adjusted the dial to the safe, which lived behind his favorite painting. She waited for what she knew was coming. "What the hell have you done with the jewels?" He came charging down the stairs in such a fury, she thought for an instant he might actually kill her. "I've sold them already." She got the words out so quickly, he didn't quite seem to understand what she had said. I've already sold them." She grinned impishly. "And converted them into gold ingots, which I have hidden, ready for us to escape." "But how did you know?" "Lloyd already told me we were in trouble. He said you were headed for debtor's prison the way things were going, and I should get what I could of value and remove it from the house so it was not sold to repay your debts." Her voice was cold and objective, not at all threatening or condemning. She had simply solved the problem as best as she saw fit. It took him a while to understand what she had said. Then he started to laugh, a deep, hefty laugh. "My goodness, woman, I knew I had married the right girl when I married you. We can start again in the Americas." She laughed too. "But I don't want to go to the Americas. I like it fine just here." It was her turn to laugh. "I think you'd better go hang." He stopped laughing as two police officers rounded the door. As he was being handcuffed, she came up to him and leaned in close to his ear. "I loved you, and you tried to cut my finger off to protect your wealth. I'm glad I set you up." The chill of terror crossed over him. You set me up?" Her lips parted into a victorious grin. "Oh, Robert, a horse. You stole a horse." Chapter 126. The governor spoke with slow, decisive words. "It is a sad day when such a crime as this takes place. A nobleman from birth, fallen to the temptation of speculation, desperately turns to thievery. The punishment must be as swift as it is hard, in order to serve as a deterrent for others." It had taken Sir Robert Williams a long time to realize he had lost. Somehow he expected the king to step in and pardon him, a fellow magistrate, or someone from the Order of the Truth, if anyone there was still alive. Robert opened his eyes to look out upon the world one last time. He had finally accepted his death. There was no crowd, no vast set of friends or onlookers who watched in horror at the lethal hand of the British justice system. The king had decided it would reflect poorly on his land if someone from such noble birth was seen to have fallen so very far. Instead, as Robert sat on the cart awaiting his fate, he looked upon just 4 faces and the covered face of his executioner. One was his wife, the other Anna, the woman he had thought he'd beaten, Jack, his weak thief, and the jailer. In the end, he was encouraged to see his wife had come to support him in his death. She had betrayed him, but today she had tears on her cheeks and wore only the black of a woman in mourning. He caught her eyes one last time and smiled at her. Their time was short together, but he had loved her. Belinda smiled back at him, and somehow it made him wonder. Was there just the flicker of a smile from a woman who won? Anna approached him. "I thought you might like to know. Your oldest son has gone to Kojo with the 95th Riflemen. Like his father, he has built debts he cannot pay. and for the shame of it, he has done the honorable thing you were unable to do, and has volunteered himself in their forlorn hope to take the castle. By this time next week, you may very well get the chance to see him in hell." Sir William's eyes displayed shock, and almost the smallest resemblance of pleasure. His lips curled with incredulity. "You don't know, do you?" "There is nothing you know that interests me any," she said with a certainty that she didn't feel. "You don't want to hear about my boys?" "What happens to your boys couldn't interest me at all." That made him laugh. It was loud and boisterous, the sardonic cry of a man who was taking great pleasure in his last win before he died. When he stopped, he said, "My boys. They're your sons. Your hatred has blinded you, and in doing so, you have single-handedly caused the death of your own son." He laughed, the insane laugh of a person who thought he had the final joke in life. "What are you talking about? How?" She held the horse from moving. He smiled at her. "I knew you were going to ruin everything, you evil whore." Then, with his last piece of defiance, he jumped off the stool, snapping his neck as he fell. The horse, content to be relieved of the weight, simply walked off, and Sir William's dangled from his neck until he was dead. Chapter 127. Anna watched in horror as the man she had hated so long chose to take his own life in order to snub her of any knowledge about her children. Belinda could do little to enlighten her, except to say she had been told he had adopted them from his brother, who died in the war. She had been told he had named the older boy after his real father. So Matthew's real name was Thomas. Jack was the first to realize what needed to be done. "Come on, there's still time. The Serendipity can catch the fleet if we leave right away. We'll ride to Portsmouth." "But how's that going to help? If he's already agreed to take the forlorn hope, he'll never be allowed to rescind it." "Leave that to me." They got there to find Thomas never got to leave. He had missed the ship. Jack apologized to him and started to explain the situation as Anna walked up to him. Thomas glanced at her. "It's you, Mother? You remember me?" "Of course I remember you. I always have. I was told you were dead." There were tears in his eyes. "I've always loved you, Mother. Your father's still alive, too. He will be so pleased." Chapter 128. David couldn't believe it when he heard the news his boys were still alive. He found it hard to get used to the idea of his older boy now being named Thomas, but otherwise could have sworn he'd thought he recognized him earlier. He was made even happier to discover his second child, Joseph, was currently living in France, studying. David moved to France, where he inherited his uncle's estate and lives happily ever after. Sarah is pregnant again. His little girl is happy. She's going to be a big sister. He never wanted to be a count or rich. All he wanted was equality for the simple farmer. Ironic how life turns out. Sarah was the most supportive during this time. He'd ended up marrying the woman he'd always loved. He didn't know anything about being a count, but he knew how to farm, and he knew how to be a good person. He just hoped he would continue to do so. Sarah told him she would ensure he never changed. Chapter 129. Portsmouth, mid-February, 1799. It was a crisp morning, but with no clouds to suppress it, the sun was already trying its best to take the bite out of the air. The majestic Serendipity rested peacefully in the calm water of its dock, its lines resting without tension in the slack tide, oblivious to the 80 or more crew who hustled along her decks and high in her rigging in preparation of her master's intentions. Captain James Jarrett walked into the main cabin. He seemed in a good mood as he greeted Jack and Anna. An old sea dog, he felt uncomfortable if he spent too long on dry land. "Good morning, milady and sir." His calloused hands fidgeted with some paper. "It's a fine day, if ever I saw one." "Yes, it's a good omen, don't you think?" Anna replied. Jack smiled. "Yes, it's a much nicer one than I remember the last time we left this place. Supplies are stored, and we are ready to cast off, sir." His eyes stared at the simple map of the world in front of them. "Can I ask where we are going?" Jack smiled at Anna and ran his hand across the world map. She smiled back at him, and in that instant he was transported to the distant dreams from his past, more than 20 years earlier, in which a person like him could go anywhere and do what he pleased. The world was his to explore. "Now then, Anna, my dearest love," he grinned mischievously, like the boy who'd once had those dreams. "Where should we go?" The end. This has been The Price of Retribution, written by Christopher Cartwright, narrated by David Gilmore. Copyright 2014 by Christopher Cartwright. Production copyright 2019 by Christopher Cartwright.